Okay, if everybody would go ahead and take your seats, please. Can you all hear me? Nothing? Testing, testing. Okay, clearly this is too far from my... Let's try down here. Is that better? Can you hear me? Okay, is it coming over the loudspeaker now? A little bit? Okay, I'll just hold it. I guess my collar isn't close enough to my big mouth here, so. Hey, good morning everyone, and I cannot tell you how excited I am to have all of you here. This is really the first big event that we have had since the COVID outbreak. So it's so thrilling to see a near to capacity group here in the Shangri-La Auditorium at the Doolittle Institute. And also we had about 800 people that registered for virtual attendance as well. So I don't know how many we actually have live on there now, but we had 800 register, so that's fantastic. So looking forward to this event. Actually, we were speaking last night to the speaker during dinner time, and we ended up talking about a lot of different topics, and COVID naturally came up, and we also brought up the fact that the United States came out with 3 new vaccines to fight COVID, which is probably a lot of the reason that we're able to be here today. And I'm also happy to say, then with high efficiency on them as well. And I could also say the topic of our discussion for today came out with this many. So, very proud of that as us being ahead of our peer adversaries in that area. But there are some other areas, like for instance, quantum communications, we also talked about a little bit, where they're ahead of us. So we can't rest on our laurels here. So that's why this is a fantastic event for us today, to be able to talk about China and what's going on over there and how we can combat that. So along those lines, the Doolittle Institute, we are a partnership intermediary for the Air Force Research Lab. And in that role, we work to connect the Air Force Research Lab with academia, industry, and other government organizations to solve problems. We don't do that work here. We don't actually solve the problems here, but we connect and we facilitate the solutions to those problems. So whether it's looking at an internal process like, contracting or something like that, and helping them come up with more streamlined ways to do things, or if there's a new product development or a research project that's starting, we work at design sprints to kind of kick off and create a rapid prototype for that. We also work to bring in university partners and have them present their research for potential funding opportunities. So we serve as the connector between AFRL and the outside world and facilitate those interactions between them. We've got a variety of people in the audience today, and if we could, just for Mr. Chang, so he kind of knows who's here, how many do we have from the Munitions Directorate of AFRL? Could you raise your hands? Okay, fantastic. Air Force Life Cycle Management Center and or the Armament Directorate? Fabulous, also another group on Eglin there. The 96 Test Wings, the tenant owners, the owners of the building. We got a few folks from the test wing here. How about AFSOC? Any AFSOC folks in the room? Excellent, thank you so much. Also wanted to do a special thank you to the Air Force Nuclear Weapons Center folks. I think most of them are attending online, but how many do we have in person here? Okay, excellent, thanks so much. And also industry partners. Do we have anybody from industry in the room? Okay, not seeing any industry, but I'm sure we got some industry folks online. Along those lines as well, we've got some very special folks in here today, some very special people. We have with us the PEO of Weapons, Brigadier General Collins. Thank you for joining us, sir. Colonel Gary Haas, has he arrived yet? Okay, I believe Colonel Haas will be joining us later. Joe Letzinger from AFRL, also Chief Scientist Dr. David Lambert from AFRL. Scott Teal, Chief Engineer at AFRL, in the back there. Also Mike Sorial, the Deputy Director from the Armament Directorate. He's not making it today, but, oh, that's right, he's in another meeting. He got called out. And lastly but not least, also Scott Keene, who's the Director of Engineering for LCMC. Thank you and welcome, Scott. So along with that, I would like to go ahead and introduce Laura Rackus to go ahead and kind of give some logistical things for today and also introduce our speaker. Come on up, Laura, thanks.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Laura Rakis. I'm the one who's been sending y'all a bunch of emails about this event. So thank you very much to all of you for coming today. Like Carolyn said, this is the largest event that we've put on here at Doolittle Institute in person since COVID happened over a year ago. So I also wanted to say thank you to all of our team members here at Doolittle Institute, because there was a lot of work and help throughout all of our team to put this on today. So we've got the virtual live stream and all of you here in person as well. So thanks to our Doolittle team. So just a couple of logistic things. Mr. Chang is going to do 3 topic sessions. Those are going to go for about 25 minutes each, and then he's going to have about 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A after each session. So during the Q&A, for the folks here in person, we have 2 microphone stands on each side of the auditorium. So if you are in person and you'd like to come up and ask a question during the Q&A period, if you'll just go to one of those microphones. And alternatively, if you are in person, you can also use the Slido app if you'd like to submit a question that way, if you'd rather do it electronically and or anonymously. And for the folks that are joining us virtually, you can use Slido for your Q&A and put in your questions there. You can put them in at any time, and then we'll go through as many as we can from online during the Q&A sessions. So the last session is actually going to be just for Q&A. And that's going to be about 20 minutes. But for the folks that are in person, and I guess anybody that's joining us online, Mr. Chang has been gracious enough that he's offered to stay and continue chatting if there is still good dialogue and conversation. So we won't kick you out at 10 after 12. So if you have some more conversation you'd like to have with him, we can do that. So the Slido code, for those in person, you actually have the QR code on your name tags. So if you don't have that code on hand, you can just scan your QR code on your name tags. And for the folks joining us virtually, you've already have access to that code. All right, so any questions about logistics? Okay. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about Mr. Chang. And his wife, Miss Lydia Chang, is also here with him today. So welcome, Miss Chang and Mr. Chang. So Gordon lived and worked in China and Hong Kong for almost 2 decades, most recently in Shanghai as counsel to an American law firm, and earlier in Hong Kong as partner in an international law firm. He's the author of Nuclear Showdown, North Korea Takes on the World, and The Coming Collapse of China, and also 2 booklets by Encounter Books titled Losing South Korea, and one that all of you may be very interested in, The Great U.S.-China Tech War. And after the event today, we will be providing, Mr. Chang gave us a reading list, suggested reading list, if you are interested in further reading on China topics of interest. Not just his books. So we'll provide that reading list afterwards, and then it'll be emailed out to everybody as well, virtual and the folks who are here. So his writings on China and North Korea have appeared in numerous prestigious publications. He's given briefings at the National Intelligence Council, Central Intelligence Agency, State Department, and the Pentagon. He has appeared before the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. And Mr. Chang has also served 2 terms as trustee of Cornell University. So lots of background and experience, and a very trusted expert and commentator on these topics. So Mr. Chang, I'd like to welcome you to the stage. And we're glad that you're here.
You can see who runs this operation. Well, thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Laura, and your team. But most of all, thank you for coming here today, and thank you for people online. This is a consequential moment for our nation, and China has made it so. As Laura has mentioned, we're going to have 3 topic sessions in addition to a Q&A one. Those 3 topics are, first, the nature of the Chinese regime, second, China's external policies, and third, China's vulnerabilities. So let's get started with the nature of the Chinese regime, and we begin with a summary. Current leader Xi Jinping has dramatically changed the nature of the Chinese political system since he took over as Communist Party General Secretary at the end of 2012. No longer do we see this consensual politics. No longer do we see live and let live. What's come back is the I live, you die struggles that are reminiscent of the Maoist era. Xi Jinping has been pushing China away from authoritarianism. You hear everyone say China's authoritarian. He's pushed China away from that towards totalitarianism. He hasn't quite succeeded yet, so I guess you could say that China is semi-totalitarian with its various social credit systems, surveillance mechanisms, and of course, the Great Firewall. Xi Jinping is the driving force on the atrocities against minorities, and he is indeed the author of the policies to eliminate all faith in China. China's regime is now especially malicious. We can see this in its criminality and its handling of the coronavirus epidemic. So that's the summary. Let's begin. And we begin with the question, why is China so belligerent? I think the answer is because China now has a strongman. And China has a strongman for many reasons, but strongman rule is inherent in a system that is founded and idealizes this struggle, the notion of struggle. We're going to take a quick tour through Chinese communist history. Mao Zedong, the founder of the People's Republic, turned what had started out as rule by committee, and he turned it into one-man rule and surrounded himself with a personality cult. He alone pushed China into a number of zany campaigns, including the Great Leap Forward at the end of the 1950s, and in the next decade, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, which lasted for 10 years. This resulted in many deaths. The estimates are low-end 30 million, high-end 70 million. Mao's successor, Deng Xiaoping, was able to again change the Chinese political system. And what he did was, as a reaction to Mao's politics, he sort of normalized things. So for instance, he brought back a semblance of committee rule. He reduced the cost of losing political struggles, and as well, he started to introduce norms and rules for Communist Party governance, including, most important, rules regarding succession. Deng, in an effort to avoid regime-ending turmoil, not only picked his successor, Jiang Zemin, but he picked Jiang Zemin's successor, who turned out to be Hu Jintao. Now, foreign observers have just gushed over what Deng Xiaoping did to normalize or institutionalize Chinese politics. And everyone said, oh, you know, China has now embarked on an era of meritocratic rule. And scholars compared China's system in its efficiency and its effectiveness, and they compared it effectively to democracies, especially to our own. So we have regime critics saying these succession rules that the Communist Party put in place shows that indeed communism can work. And as a result of that, Mao's rule was viewed as an aberration. But those assessments were premature because Hu Jintao, the predecessor to the current ruler, was a weak leader. And indeed, in China, his 10 years of rule, which ended in 2012, is considered and sometimes called the lost decade. Now, senior Chinese leaders at the end of this rule of Hu said, we need somebody who can get things done. And so they picked a guy named Xi Jinping. And then Xi Jinping immediately turned on those who picked him. And Xi Jinping was actually successful because the ruling group at the top of the Communist Party was complacent, and they were not prepared for what Xi Jinping was doing. Now, in addition, Xi realized that he needed to amass power to rule effectively, and he also knew, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, that he did not have a political base when he became General Party Secretary. So what he did was he made the military the core of his support. And I think the rise of the military during the early years of Xi Jinping explain a number of things that we have witnessed in the last 10 years. So, there was one-man rule at the beginning of the People's Republic. There's one-man rule now. And this suggests that strongmen, which are evident at both ends of the communist period in China, actually are normal for China's system. And it was the so-called normal era of Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao that really was the aberration. Now, political scientists will tell you that one-man systems are completely unstable, or at least the least stable of all political systems, and indeed, they are the least predictable. And that's because the one person at the top of the heap is not only alone, but also insecure. Although Xi Jinping is extraordinarily powerful, he does have opponents. Now, those opponents won't sometimes make themselves known. They oftentimes try to hide in the shadows because they don't want to be cut down. But they are nonetheless there, and they are willing to pounce. Xi Jinping knows that, and so to protect his flanks, he has made his policies aggressive and belligerent, so he can't be criticized from that side. So any failure to stand up to the Americans, any gaffe, whether foreign or otherwise, makes Xi Jinping's rule especially vulnerable. Power brings vulnerability. In China's consensus-driven system that we saw in the Deng, Zhang, and Hu eras, no Chinese leader got too much credit. No Chinese leader got too much blame. And the reason is decisions were made by everybody at the top of the Chinese political system. In other words, at the Politburo, which generally has about 25 or so members, and also at the Politburo Standing Committee, the apex of political power in China. But in the Xi Jinping system, as we now see it, that's no longer true. People can be blamed. Matter of fact, one person can be blamed. Because Xi Jinping has accumulated so much power, because he's taken power from everybody else, because nobody else is responsible for anything anymore, there's only one person to blame. And that's, unfortunately for Xi Jinping, it's difficult to lay off responsibility for mistakes that occur. Furthermore, since 2012, Xi Jinping has raised the cost of losing political struggles. In the Mao era, if you lost a political struggle, you generally lost everything, sometimes your life. In the era of Deng Xiaoping, you lose a political struggle, you get a very nice house in Beijing. Xi Jinping era, if you lose, again, you lose your freedom, you lose your assets, you lose your reputation. The only thing that people haven't lost, with the exception of 3 criminals about 6 years ago, where you don't lose your life. But for Xi Jinping, though, he knows that because he has changed the political system in this way, if he fails, he can lose not only almost everything, he could lose everything. So this means that China's ruler has a very low threshold of risk. And this means that China's ruler can surprise us by doing things that, at least to us, don't make sense. And so therefore, in a hyper-political time in China, we can see that there is every incentive for Xi Jinping to take extreme positions. Unfortunately, Xi Jinping does not need encouragement to do that. Let's remember that he is at heart a Maoist. And China's leader is indeed pushing China back to the past. We see this, and we saw this almost immediately, because he is now furthering and promoting reactionary positions. So this march back to the past started almost immediately. December 2012, 1 month after being named General Party Secretary, Xi Jinping gives a fiery secret speech to cadres in Guangdong province. That's the southern province that surrounds Hong Kong. And in that speech, Xi Jinping staunchly defended Communist Party prerogatives and talked about the fall of the Soviet Union. Xi Jinping said that Chinese cadres had to learn from the deep lessons of the fall of the Soviet Union, and they had to return to Leninist discipline. Leninism is control, so you can see why China is going back to a semi-totalitarian, totalitarian system. Xi Jinping said, quote, "Why did the Soviet Union disintegrate? Why did the Soviet Communist Party collapse? An important reason," this is quoting now, "was that their ideals and convictions wavered." Well, in Xi Jinping's China, there's no wavering on communist principles. There's no wavering on Leninist control mechanisms. And so, for instance, we see Xi Jinping trying to put together a social credit system. China now has, they claim, 626 million surveillance cameras. Those cameras feed information into China's artificial intelligence, big data networks, facial recognition. And so what they want to do is to put all of that, as I said, into a social credit system, which was supposed to be in place last year, a nationwide system, because they had a lot of separate social credit experiments around China. Some worked, some didn't. They wanted to amalgamate all those, and they had 2020 as a deadline. They appeared to have missed that, but they're still working towards it. But when this system is in place, all of these cameras, all of this facial recognition software, all of these surveillance mechanisms are going to be fed into one system where a person gets a score. Everybody gets a score, which is constantly updated based upon observed behaviors. So if in China you jaywalk, for instance, well, a surveillance camera will pick it up, facial identification will find out who you are, and your score will go down. So, yeah, they want to prevent jaywalking, but they also want to prevent criticism of the regime. So if you post something on WeChat that they don't like, then your score will go down. So with these low scores, what China is trying to do is, of course, to modify behavior. And they want, as officials say, to deny those who who have low scores, they want to deny them the ability, as they say, to take a single step. That means, for instance, you can't board a train because you can't buy a ticket, you can't get a mortgage for your flat, you cannot send your child to private school. Chinese officials are even talking about putting low-scored individuals and not allowing them to leave their home. In short, as The Economist said, what China is trying to do is to create the world's first digital totalitarian state. And then, once that system is perfected in China, you know that they're going to extend it to the world, so you guys are going to have your own scores in China's system. And even today, China is taking video feeds from Vancouver, from a chain of restaurants there, and they are feeding that into their social credit system. So that system is nothing short of Orwellian. Xi Jinping demands that society show complete obedience, absolute obedience is what he says, to the Communist Party, and he demands that the Communist Party show absolute obedience to himself. Last week, a prominent European China watcher summarized this whole system into one phrase. This phrase is, one country, one people, one ideology, one party, one leader. So to enforce this uniformity, Xi Jinping is trying to remove foreign influence from China. One of the ways he's doing this is isolating China from the rest of the world. And that gives Xi more control. Because Xi does demand complete obedience. And nowhere is this clearer than his attempt to eliminate faith. Yes, he's going after Christianity as his predecessors did, because Christianity is deemed to be a foreign religion. But for the first time, China is also moving against Buddhism, which is considered to be a Chinese religion. So there's no room in Xi Jinping's China for anything but complete devotion to atheism. Now, this obsessive demand really gives us the context for the atrocities that are occurring in what China calls Xinjiang, the northwestern part of the country you see on the maps, and what many of the inhabitants there believe is their own separate homeland called East Turkestan. So China has put in camps, which meet the definition of concentration camps, at least 1.3 million Uighurs, Kazakhs, and other Turkic minorities. Maybe as many as 3 million, we don't know. But they've put millions there. We know that people are being brutalized and tortured, and we know that people are being killed in those camps. We know people are being killed in camps because China's building crematoria next to the camps. We know that there is the systematic and institutionalized rape of women. There is the institutionalization of slavery, as tens of thousands, maybe even more, of Uyghurs and Kazakhs and other minorities are shipped around China in trains to provide labor to domestic companies and to foreign ones, including American ones. We know that children are being separated from their parents and being put in prison-like facilities, which the Chinese call orphanages, but which really are not. We know that there is organ harvesting, almost certainly for profit. Beijing's policies, forced abortions, forced sterilization, killing, other things constitute genocide under Article 2 of the Genocide Convention of 1948. These are crimes against humanity. Why do we care? We care because the Chinese, if they had the power, would treat us like they treat the Uyghurs and the Kazakhs. Let's talk about COVID-19. Where did it come from? On May 26, President Biden ordered the intelligence community to do a review and report back to him in 90 days. I'm waiting for August 24th, but we know before then that there is growing and compelling evidence that this came from a lab. SARS-CoV-2, the pathogen causing this disease, looks to be engineered. So for instance, there are unusual, unnatural combinations of amino acids. The so-called double CGG sequence is virtually impossible to occur in nature. It's exactly what researchers would do if they were trying to do this. This is evidence of splicing of a regime. Alina Chan of the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard talks about how, isn't it strange that SARS-CoV-2 did not mutate when it first got into the human population? That's almost impossible. Her answer is, well, it didn't mutate when it got into humans because it already mutated in a lab. We have all sorts of other evidence. Virologists are going to argue about this. The alternative, of course, is the wet market theory. In other words, a natural mutation of this disease, often said to be from a bat to an intermediary mammal, like a pangolin or a civet, and from that intermediary mammal into humans. Scientists just love this theory. They love this theory because they absolutely know that other scientists cannot engage in evil experimentation. Only problem, though, is that nobody has ever been able to find SARS-CoV-2 in nature. They can't find the reservoir. They can't document the transmission links. Indeed, the first cases of COVID-19 occurred far from that wet market, have no connection to the wet market in Wuhan at all, which was first identified as the place of last transmission to humans. Former Deputy National Security Advisor Matt Pottinger in December, in a Zoom call with British parliamentarians, actually said that establishment figures in Beijing openly dismiss the West market theory. Richard Dearlove, the head of MI6 at the turn of the century, said this pathogen looks, quote unquote, somewhat tailored. There's circumstantial evidence of a leak. 3 researchers from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is suspected to be the source of this, 3 researchers, November 2019, fall ill with COVID-19-like symptoms and are hospitalized. Following month, December, a wife of a researcher at the institute falls sick with COVID-19-like symptoms, and she dies. We know that the Wuhan Institute of Virology bragged about actually storing more than 1,500 strains of coronavirus. it was engaged in dangerous gain of function research. It failed to adhere to safety protocols. And of course, the first case of COVID-19 arises very close to that institute, which, by the way, is in a part of China that never generates disease. China generates a lot of disease, but they all come from the south, Guangdong or Yunnan, not from the center of the country. Also, we know in the last couple days, despite great denials, the Wuhan Institute was actually storing live bats. Another clue. China has been desperately trying to hide the origin of this disease. It's hindering the mission of the World Health Organization in January and February of this year is indeed troubling, especially because China did not absolutely refuse to turn over raw patient data, especially the 174 cases that were identified as maybe being able to provide important clues as to the origin of this disease. We know that China, at the World Health Assembly meeting a couple of weeks ago, that's the governing body for WHO, absolutely refused to allow further investigations onto its soil. So, at this point, we don't know 100% that this came from a lab, but there is something that we do know 100%, and that is China took decisions to inevitably spread this disease beyond its borders. China admitted human-to-human transmissibility of COVID-19 on January 20 of last year. Chinese leaders knew at least 5 weeks before. A Harvard Medical School study suggests they knew 5 months before, but at least 5 weeks, that this was a highly contagious disease. If Beijing had said nothing about contagiousness, that would have been grossly irresponsible. But we know that they went out and they lied. They tried to tell the international community that this was not contagious. Just a couple of days ago, we heard that Dr. Robert Redfield, who was head of our CDC at the time, actually got on the phone with his counterpart, Gao Fu, and Gao Fu said, don't worry, Bob, this is not going to be contagious. At the same time, Xi Jinping pressured countries not to impose travel restrictions and quarantines on arrivals from China while he was locking down parts of his own country. Lockdowns are controversial, but by locking down his own country, Xi Jinping was thinking that he was going to stop the spread of the disease. So by forcing other countries to take arrivals from China, he knew that he was spreading the disease beyond his borders. This is the first time in history that one nation has attacked all the others. And unfortunately, there is no other interpretation. This was a malicious and deliberate spread of the disease. So, where does this leave us? Well, we know that this is not the last disease that will come from China's borders. China's National Defense University, in its 2017 edition of the Science of Military Strategy, actually said, look, we want to engage in a new type of biological warfare, quote, of specific ethnic genetic attacks. In other words, they want to build pathogens that will leave the Chinese immune and sicken and kill everybody else. 2017 saw the publishing of a book by Chinese military researchers also talking about these specific ethnic genetic attacks. So the next disease from China will not just sicken everybody. It could leave China as the world's only viable society. In other words, this could be a civilization killer. And the connection with the Chinese military became very clear. We saw this in January of last year when China sent the woman who is often described as China's top biological weapons expert, Major General Chen Wei, to head the P4 biosafety unit at the Wuhan Institute. We don't know what her job was beyond some general descriptions that Beijing gave, but it was clear that she was there to hide evidence of a lab leak, as well as to hide the evidence of a prohibited biological weapons program. Could China be this malicious? Well, Chinese leaders have adopted a Soviet concept, comprehensive national power, which is a series of metrics to measure the strength of countries. And China, of course, wants to be number one. Now, as my friend Cleo Pascal, the Foundation for Defense of Democracy says, there's two ways to become number one. First of all, you strengthen your own country, which is what we all do. That's fair. And the other way is you weaken everybody else. And that is what I believe China did. China says it doesn't have a doctrine of unrestricted warfare. But what we saw last year, what we see in the future, looks unrestricted nonetheless. We always talk about Chinese generals and admirals changing the definition of warfare. Well, they just did so. And one final point about COVID-19. Everybody in the US policy establishment, every American leader from Clinton on talked about how China would become more responsible. It would become benign as it became part of the international community and had a stake in it. Let's go back to 2002, 2003. That's the SARS epidemic. China acted abominably, but it was probably just gross negligence on their part. But the gross negligence that we saw of last decade, of the first decade of this century, has now turned into the maliciousness of this one. Unfortunately, this is not the only example of the criminality of the Chinese regime. January of last year, US Customs and Border Protection agents at the International Falls Port of Entry in Minnesota intercept 900,000 counterfeit US $1 bills. They were made in China. Who counterfeits $1 bills? Nobody does that for profit. I don't know what China was doing. I have suspicions, but whatever it is, counterfeiting another country's currency is an act of war. And you can't counterfeit American currency in China without the regime knowing about it. May of last year, Louisville, Customs and Border Protection seizes automatic weapons parts coming in from China. I don't know how that happened, but there are no innocent explanations. And again, there's fentanyl, the opioid, synthetic opioid. This is manufactured and distributed around the world by large Chinese gangs. These gangs are so well organized, there's no question the Chinese regime has to know what's going on, especially in a near total surveillance state. Last year, we don't have the figures for American deaths from fentanyl, but I think it's probably around 45,000 when you include direct deaths from fentanyl and the growing number of cocaine deaths that are mixed with fentanyl and methamphetamines also mixed with this opioid. This, unfortunately, is intentional. So the Chinese services are on top of drug trafficking. We have, as a nation, failed to take into account the intentions of the Chinese regime. Why is China engaging in this conduct, which is more and more recently? Xi Jinping can do it. Very few limits on it. He believes that the entire world, as we'll talk about in later sessions, is required to show subjugation to China. I don't know what he is doing, but when we look into all of this, we can see that there is a logic of communism. We can't always understand it, but when you mix communism with someone like Xi Jinping, it is indeed a toxic brew. Thank you. Questions? Unless you all agree with me, but.
You were mentioning the use of slave labor. Are there any U.S. laws against U.S. companies in China using slave labor or in other foreign countries?
There is a law which allows customs to seize items made with slave labor that can't be imported into the U.S. And so, for instance, about a month ago, the U.S. seized finished goods from Uniqlo, which is fast retailing, the biggest retailer in Japan. And they were made with, the US contends, slave labor. I don't believe that there is actually a law, a US law, which criminalizes the use of slaves outside the US. We don't have jurisdiction to do many of those things.
So
But
if they made it in China and then exported to, say, India or someplace, as far as you know, that doesn't actually violate any law?
Yeah, I don't think they're violating federal law, but we do have the power to seize those goods as they come into the US. And indeed, we should do it. We should do it for a number of reasons. One of them is just that that's an atrocity. But second of all, we're putting Americans out of work when we allow Nike, for instance, which Nike has used slave labor in the past. And I'll talk about that in a second. But we're putting Americans out of work when we allow the use of slave labor because that drives down the cost of producers in China and Americans can't compete. Nike, through a long-term sub-Korean contractor, was using Uighurs in a concentration camp-like facility in Qingdao. Now, Nike Nike doesn't make sneakers, it makes it through contractors, but it had a long-term relationship with this contractor. And so they knew what was going on. So Nike, which is a company, and I will editorialize here, that likes to lecture me about all sorts of things, was using minority slaves to produce its shoes, and it knowingly did so. I will stop here on this lecture because I get really, really angry when I think about these things. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Ursula. How, in your opinion, is Americans open to all immigration policy hurting, as in a declared or non-declared war against China? Obviously, from my accent, I benefited from this policy, but how is this policy hurting? And the second part to my question is, you read from documents and stuff that China has had a policy in place, to kind of take over for centuries now. How late is America in this fight against China?
Great. My dad came to the U.S. on a Chinese government scholarship. This was the Chinese government before the communists took over, so I'm sympathetic with that. The only thing about this with regard to China is that every Chinese national is under a compulsion to spy for Beijing. There's a 2017 National Intelligence Law, Article 7 and 14, requires every Chinese national, every Chinese company to spy. So that, for us, is something that's difficult for us to deal with because, as a nation, we don't want to brand an entire group as a nation of spies, especially a racial group. But nonetheless, I think that this does give us the right to exert special scrutiny on arrivals from China because of that. And I believe that long term, nobody should be, I'll be a little bit controversial, but I do believe that people who are in our armed forces, people who work for our federal government, if they are Chinese nationals, I would hope that they would become American citizens. Which is not to say that they won't spy for Beijing, but it is to say that they will no longer be under that compulsion to spy. So that really, to us, I think is important for us to understand. We have difficulty picking out ethnic groups, but I believe that we have the obligation to do so because of Chinese laws. Also, it's not just Chinese law. The Communist Party has a top-down system where nobody is permitted to disobey the Communist Party. So forget the 2017 National Intelligence Law, if it wanted someone to spy, it can do so. That, to me, is something that we need to take into account in security reviews and all the rest of it. On the rest of the question about subversion of the United States, we're late into this game. And the reason is that we did not want to think that China wanted to do this. But we saw last year, for instance, China actually actively encourage violence on American streets. And this goes beyond subversion. This is an act of war. Radio Free Asia reported that an intelligence unit of the People's Liberation Army actually based themselves in the Houston consulate. And from there, they used artificial intelligence and big data to identify Americans likely to participate in Black Lives Matter and Antifa protests. And then they sent them videos via TikTok on how to riot. We know that the European bureau chief of China Daily, actually on Twitter on October 18th of last year, openly said he wanted Americans to throw petrol bombs on American streets. I don't know how it becomes much clearer than that. There are rumors which are unverified, but which many people believe are true, that the Chinese government actually organized protesters to engage in violent acts on the night of May 31st, 1 block north of the White House. That was the night that St. John's Church was burned. These unconfirmed reports mirror other ones in Los Angeles and other Southern California locations of Chinese protesters acting in coordination, talking about being organized by being engaged in the Chinese government organized them to be on American streets. It's just really, really bad. And we have a society right now that's being overwhelmed. FBI is overwhelmed, CIA is incompetent, local governments are overwhelmed. We're in a fight for our society, and we could lose our country because China, and we'll talk about this in the next session, China wants to overthrow our government. Online. There are online questions?
Yes. So, first question from online. If the COVID-19 outbreak is eventually confirmed to come from a lab, what do you see as the geopolitical fallout for China in the coming years?
That's a great question. And it's something I'll talk about a little bit later. But the point is that this is an issue which China can't avoid right now. And it's an issue for where they will not have a good answer. So I believe that we're heading towards a break with China. It's not that we want that break, but today 600,012 Americans have succumbed to COVID-19. And that is a loss that we cannot ignore. So I believe that for that, and also the similar for China's atrocities in Xinjiang. These are issues which can't be avoided for various reasons. And because of that, I believe that we will have extremely rocky relations with Beijing. We've seen this already. So for instance, European Union, the EU Parliament last month overwhelmingly voted to freeze implementation of the investment agreement, Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, CAI. And they did that because Beijing imposed sanctions on EU parliamentarians and EU officials. And the reason why that happened was because the EU sanctioned Chinese officials for committing those atrocities. So you see that there is this dynamic that is occurring. And I think that it's going to occur, especially with COVID-19, because this for us becomes personal.
Hey, sir, just wanted your feedback on, so as you mentioned how China has been moving from more authoritarian to more totalitarianism. So back in October, Jack Ma, who was one of the co-founders of Alibaba, mentioned in a speech somewhat critical of the Chinese financial system and banking system, and then kind of disappeared from public view for 3 months. Just wanted your opinion on that situation, and really what's kind of going on behind the scenes with that situation.
Thank you for asking that question, because I hadn't really planned to talk about the Chinese economy. Jack Ma is the founder of Alibaba, which is becoming the world's biggest online retailer. And he's also the founder of Ant Group, which has developed one of the 2 major payment platforms in China, the other one being WeChat Pay. Jack Ma, who's a Communist Party member, we learned, gave a speech, I think it was October 24th of last year, at the Shanghai Bund Summit, high-profile financial event, where he made some offhand critical comments of the Chinese central bank and Chinese bankers in general, where he talked about how really Chinese banking was way behind the times. It was too collateral focused. These are comments that he and others have made in the past, but what they did was, and just by way of background for everyone, they triggered alarm bells in Beijing, and Beijing put on hold the initial public offering of Ant Group, which was going to be the world's largest IPO. And they put it on hold 3 days before it was supposed to go live, which is an extraordinary event. And this shows you that Xi Jinping's demand for complete obedience and for love and adoration is wounding China itself. Because China has the world's most sophisticated payment platforms. That's Ant Group. And Ant really was, I think, what Jack Ma was thinking about when he was talking about how China's financial system was antiquated, how the lending was too collateral-based and all the rest of it. So China was really moving ahead, far ahead of the US in terms of these things. And yet what has happened is there's been these crackdowns on the online retailers, plus also crackdowns on Alipay and WeChat Pay, which are these two online payment platforms. So really China has wounded itself in ways. Now Jack Ma surfaced for about 1 minute in a video that he gave to some school children in Hangzhou, his hometown. And he's generally been out of sight, I think. He showed up once on one beach or something like that since then. So this is since basically the end of October of last year. He has been essentially out of circulation. And this shows you just the nature of the Chinese system. And as you point out, this is an example of moving back to a semi-totalitarian system that demands obedience and indeed it demands praise from people like Jack Ma. So I worry about China a lot. They are doing things which are very difficult for us to counter, going back to your point. But we can always, or most of the time, count on the Chinese to undercut themselves. And Jack Ma is a perfect example of that. Just one other note. People worry about the digital renminbi, the new currency. This new digital currency is not really meant to take over from the dollar, which everyone says. Really what it is intended to do is to undercut WeChat Pay and Alipay, these two platforms, and this relates to Jack Ma, because China wants the information that these online platforms have been accumulating. So, China is hurting itself.
Yes, sir. My name is Azhar Ali. How would you characterize China's risk assessment for military conflict, both globally and regionally, and in particular in the South China Sea?
China doesn't want war. China wants to do things to push the US and others out of the South China Sea, East China Sea, and peripheral waters, out of the Yellow Sea. And so what Beijing is doing is a really multifaceted program, which involves not only their Navy, but also their Coast Guard, their maritime militia, the little blue men, as Andrew Erickson of the Naval War College talks about. China doesn't want war, but then again, that's not the end of the story, because China is doing things that could easily cause a war. So for instance, to go back to that famous incident on April 1st, 2001, where a hotshot Chinese fighter pilot clips the wing of the Navy EP-3. But for extraordinary skills of one aviator, we would have lost that plane. If we had lost that plane, life would have been very, very different in relations with China. Because once you start killing Americans, then it's lights out in terms of the discussion. And we almost lost, 11 aviators that day. That could very well happen again, because China's continuing dangerous intercepts of the Navy and the Air Force in the global commons. You go back to spring of 2018 over Djibouti, they laser a C-130. I don't know if it was Air Force or Navy. I guess it was Navy. They blind both of the pilots. Again, we were lucky that they were able to land that plane. But this is extraordinarily dangerous. The point here is not Chinese aggressiveness, but the failure of the US to deal with it. And this is not a military question. This is a political question. That we have had political leaders who have not taken care of military, asked them to go into harm's way, but adopt policies that ensure that there'll be more dangerous intercepts. What I'm talking about is after the EP-3 landed at Hainan, we allowed the Chinese to strip the plane. We allowed them to hold the crew. The Bush administration even offered to pay a ransom to the Chinese to free the crew. We couldn't fly the plane out. So what do you think the Chinese believe? of course they believe that they can do it again. And that puts you in harm's way. I'm fortunately a civilian, so it doesn't affect me, but it does affect you.
Gordon, why don't you take one online and then we'll go to break.
Could you talk about China's strategy behind the nurturing of technology innovation hubs like Shenzhen from a national security perspective?
Yeah, great question. And I'll talk a little bit about technology in the last session. Shenzhen is really quite marvelous to behold. It is not just the Huawei's of the world, which Huawei Technologies is China's national champion, the world's largest maker of telecom equipment gear. Up until last year, it was the world's largest maker of smartphones. Has received something on the order of $75 billion or so in subsidies from the Chinese government. But more important, it has the support of the Chinese government, so every Chinese diplomat is a Huawei salesperson. But the miracle of Shenzhen is not so much the Chinese government-directed, subsidized businesses like Huawei, but it's a whole bunch of smaller startups that you can find in Shenzhen. The ones that pose a national security challenge to us are the government-funded ones. So for instance, China uses Huawei to filch information. In an example I'll talk about, between 2012 and 2017, in the Chinese built and funded headquarters of the African Union in Addis Ababa, they were using Huawei servers to surreptitiously download every night data from that organization. We know that Huawei servers are going to be put into Piraeus, the Greek port, because COSCO, China Ocean Shipping Company, has management of the port. And one of the first things they did was they wired it up with a communication system and an IT network. So we have NATO partners who are using Huawei equipment. And indeed, we even have Huawei equipment in our telecom backbone, although we have a rip and replace program, which within about 2 years will get all the Huawei equipment out. But obviously, this is not just the question of filching equipment. When you go to a 5G world, the issue is, will they be able to manipulate devices that are connected to the Internet of Things? Internet of Things will be your front door, your toaster, your car, your pacemaker. And the question is, can China manipulate those? And so that's about as much national security as you can get, especially in the first moments before a war. If they have eyes on the U.S. through surveillance cameras that they built. State Department actually put Hikvision surveillance cameras in one of their embassies, which is another issue. But the point is that the Chinese can, see almost everything. Our second topic is China's foreign policies. And again, we start with the summary. Communist Party foreign policy has always been tightly bound to domestic intrigue in Beijing, but now even more so under Xi Jinping. And that suggests that this wolf warrior diplomacy that people talk about, China's new belligerent stance, really suggests that something is not quite right in the Chinese capital. Now, China is, of course, as we've seen, trying to break apart its neighbors, Japan, India, Nepal, the Philippines. It's also challenging the US Navy and the US Air Force in the global commons. This is getting to be an accelerating situation. Aggressive Chinese actions are forcing a counter-reaction. And for instance, we see that China's neighbors in the United States are getting much closer together. One manifestation of this, of course, is the Quad. Australia, Japan, India, and the United States. The Quad is beginning to take shape and to operationalize itself. European countries are now actually starting to patrol Asian waters. We saw the NATO ministerial a couple days ago actually talk about China as a systemic challenger. Xi Jinping, he's not content with just breaking apart his neighbors. He talks about ruling the entire world. Chinese officials actually discuss Moon and Mars being part of the People's Republic. China once talked about spanning the world with its Belt and Road Initiative. Belt and Road which is obviously integral to China's plans, has hit a few stumbling blocks recently. We'll talk about that. But let's remember that the #1 goal of Chinese communist foreign policy is the maintenance of Communist Party rule. That's the summary. We'll start with Belt and Road. Xi Jinping in 2013 announced 2 separate initiatives, the Silk Road Economic Belt and the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road, which were 2 routes to connect the eastern part of China to Europe. Since that time, they have been amalgamated. They're now known as Belt and Road, or BRI. And indeed, the Chinese have answered a question that China watchers have asked for some time. The question is, are Chinese officials Mackinder-ites, or are they Mahanians? John Halford Mackinder proposed his heartland theory, which he believed was the center of the world. The heartland was parts of Eastern Europe, parts of Western Europe, and the interior portions of Asia, not including China. And Mackinder said, basically, look, whoever controls Eastern Europe controls the heartland. Whoever controls the heartland controls the world island being Europe, Asia, and Africa. And whoever controls the world island controls the world. Closely related to this was the Rimland theory of Nicholas John Speakman. Speakman believed that whoever controlled the Rimland, which were the areas surrounding Russia, controlled Eurasia. Whoever controlled Eurasia controlled, as he put it, the destinies of the world. Alfred Thayer Mahan, a little bit before Mackinder, talked in different terms about control of the sea lanes, conferring control of the world. But as China amalgamated Belt and Road, the belt being the land route to Europe, the road being the sea route to Europe, it became clear that Chinese wanted to control not only Mackinder's heartland, not only Speakman's Rimland, but also the sea lanes that Mahan talked about. Now, perhaps the most significant addition to Belt and Road, because this has become a much larger program, it's been extended to the entire world, is something that someone over here asked a question about, and that is the digital Silk Road. That was first proposed in 2015, and it became part of the Belt and Road in May 2017. So Belt and Road has been, as the Chinese call it, the project of the century. Now, the project of the century had a centerpiece, and that was the Mediterranean. So just to give you an example of how this worked in practice, China Ocean Shipping Company, COSCO, I mentioned a few moments ago, took control of the Piraeus port. In 2008, it got control of one of the docks, and then afterwards, 8 years later, controlled the public company that had the contract to manage the entire port. And one of the first things that China did was it used Huawei to provide the IT network and the communications network for Piraeus. And we can see this in other ports that China has gotten control of in the Mediterranean. So this really has been an integral part of what China's been trying to do. And as I mentioned, this is not a theoretical concern, because we saw what the Chinese did with the headquarters of the African Union. At one point, Belt and Road looked unstoppable. But here's again an example of the Chinese wounding themselves. Because what they did was they extended a lot of loans. Those loans were high interest payments. Countries were not able to pay them back. And so we have what is called debt trap diplomacy. And debt trap diplomacy sometimes works very well. So for instance, we know that China's first and so far only offshore military base is in Djibouti, in the Horn of Africa, which is adjacent to critical shipping lanes that go through, for instance, the Suez Canal. Now, Djibouti is indebted, heavily indebted to China for infrastructure loans, owing, it's believed, more than 100% of its gross domestic product to China. So, this is an example of debt trap diplomacy working. But many of the projects that China has financed have not worked. And debt trap diplomacy traps the creditor as well as the debtor. So in the last 2 or 3 years, BRI loans from China. The lending has basically collapsed, as Chinese officials say. And although propaganda workers talk about Belt and Road, they don't do so with the same enthusiasm as 2 or 3 years ago. So this is an example of China's Belt and Road being an expensive project, but not one which actually will get it to where it needs to be. But just because Belt and Road may not be successful from an economic point of view, because remember, the Chinese were trying to build infrastructure that the private sector didn't want to build, it can have geopolitical benefits, and it's not just Djibouti. So for instance, in Freeport on Grand Bahama Island, a Hong Kong company is building a container port, the Freeport Container Port, putting in something like $3 billion, maybe $3.4 billion. The idea is that with an enlarged Panama Canal, there'll be need for subsidiary ports around the region. But there's also a Chinese port, also in the Bahamas, on Abaco Island, which is completely unjustifiable from a commercial point of view. And the reason why we should be concerned that China's throwing away money in Bahamas is because of what's happened in Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka, China took over Hanban-Toto. They did this 3 years ago, 4 years ago. Hanban-Toto was a container port project. Didn't quite work out, so China took essentially 70% of the equity and a 99-year lease. This took place at the end of 2017. Sri Lanka is important for the Chinese Navy. In October and September of 2014, a Chinese sub, along with its tender, docked at the Colombo International Container Terminal, which is also Chinese funded. And the concern that we Americans must have is that Freeport will become another Colombo or Hanban-Toto. Remember that Freeport is about 87 miles east of Palm Beach. So that gives us a concern about it. Because you know, we heard General Townsend, the commander of AFRICOM, say that China wants ports on the west coast of Africa, and he talked about Namibia, Mauritania, and yes, they also want your runway at Lodges in the Azores, but they're also on this side of the Atlantic, and that's where their ambitions are. So the concern here is, although this is not a sustainable plan, it is one which has important geopolitical benefits which could put us at risk. But it's not just the Bahamas. Xi Jinping believes that he is the inheritor to Chinese emperors. And for 2 millennia, Chinese emperors believed that the rest of the world owed an obligation of subservience to the Chinese. You will hear a lot of people in this country talk about how the China-US competition is just one of history's boys will be boys competitions for dominance. And they say that all that the United States wants to do is protect its position at the top of the international system. This feeds into China's narrative that the United States is in terminal decline and that we're jealously trying to prevent China from rising. Well, it is true, of course, that we're trying to protect our position in the existing international order, but we're trying to do more than that. We're trying to protect the order itself. And this is the system, some people call it the Westphalian International Order, that is bound by rules, guidelines, conventions, and norms. Xi Jinping, unfortunately, does not agree with this. He doesn't accept that system, and he's attempting to impose China's imperial era notions on the world. Now, the one notion that underpinned China's, the imperial system was that nations near and far needed to acknowledge Chinese dominance. They believed that they not only had the mandate of heaven over Tianxia, which means all under heaven, but they also believed that heaven actually compelled China to rule the world. Now, Xi Jinping has been using Tianxia-like language for more than a decade, but recently his pronouncements have become unmistakable. So for instance, in his 2017 New Year's message, he said this, quote, "The Chinese have always held that the world is united and all under heaven. there's that phrase, that all under heaven are one family. And if this weren't explicit enough, Wang Yi, his foreign minister, in September 2017, wrote an article in Study Times, which is the influential newspaper of the Central Party School. And in that article, Wang Yi wrote that Xi Jinping thought, and in Communist Party lingo, a thought is an important body of ideological work, that Xi Jinping thought made innovations on and transcended the traditional Western international relations thinking of the past 300 years. So you take September 2017, when Wang Yi wrote this article, you subtract 300 years, you almost get to 1648. 1648, and so Wang Yi, with his time reference, was pointing to the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648, which established the current international system of competing sovereign states. So when Wang Yi wrote that Xi Jinping wants to transcend this system, what he's really saying is that Xi Jinping doesn't believe that there should be sovereign states, or at least no more of them than China. And so we talk about China being a competitor, as President Biden said. We're not competitors, because competitors assume that you're playing by the same set of rules. We're looking at a China that doesn't want to adjust this system, doesn't want to compete with us in this system. It wants to overthrow the system altogether, which means that China is once again ruled by a revolutionary. And the Chinese ambitions go well beyond those of the two of Chinese emperors. Starting in 2008, you have Chinese officials start to talk about the Moon and Mars as being sovereign Chinese territory. In other words, part of the People's Republic of China. They talk about the Moon and Mars as like they do in the South China Sea. In other words, theirs and theirs alone. And then they say that, and they imply, that they will exclude other nations from going to the Moon and Mars if the Chinese are able to get there first. Yes, this is ludicrous. But no, I'm not exaggerating. This is what they are saying. And we Americans are very good at ignoring what our adversaries and enemies say about us. By the way, to put a cap on this, about a month ago, China announced the name of its Mars rover. And it said, Mars rover is named Zhurong. And Chinese propaganda said, Zhurong was the god of fire. It's appropriate for Mars. Yes, but Zhurong is also a Chinese god of war, and he's a god of the South China Sea. So Chinese ambitions are something like we have never seen before. The good news here is that the world is starting to work together, because we've seen a remarkable shift in attitudes. So for instance, we have witnessed since in the Biden era, the US Navy becoming much more active in waters adjacent to Taiwan. And also we have seen Japan start to talk about Taiwan as its national security concern. Matter of fact, Japan at the recent G7 meeting was instrumental in including Taiwan language in the final communique. President Biden wants Japan to do more. That was evident when Japanese Prime Minister Suga was in Washington about 6 weeks ago. But at least we see the region moving in the right direction. China, of course, is noticing. After a long period of quiet around Taiwan, in response, I believe, to the NATO and the G7 communiques, on Tuesday, China sent its largest number of planes, about 28, into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, which is not sovereign Taiwan airspace, but is considered to be a hostile act nonetheless. But the other story and the good part of this is that before this big incursion on Tuesday, China actually went quiet for about a month. And I think they went quiet because they saw that Prime Minister Suga was very interested in Taiwan and was even able to talk about it in public, which is something that even his predecessor just did not want to do. So we're moving in the right direction. And one other good news item. About a week ago, a C-17 landed at Taipei Airport with 2 US senators. The reaction from China was muted. Good news for all of us. The question is, how long can China stay in a relatively quiet phase? I believe Beijing can do this for a month or two, but it really can't do it for long. And there are three factors to consider. First of all, there's the Chinese atrocities and COVID-19. Second, developments inside the Chinese political system. Third, the inherent nature of Chinese communism. As we talked about in the Q&A, I believe that because of China's spreading of the disease, because of what China is doing in Xinjiang, that this creates a dynamic that will eventually end up in more and more severe agreements between China and the rest of the world. Second point, Xi Jinping has inherited a communist party that is not a monolith. Now, China tries to make its communist party look to be invincible and a monolith, but it's not that way. It's really just a collection of competing factions and groups and coalitions that shift all the time. Now, people say that Xi Jinping was the head of the princeling faction, but princeling really is just a term for sons and daughters of senior leaders, former officials. Princelings have views that span the political spectrum. They're not a coherent group. They're not a coherent group like the Shanghai Gang of former leader Jiang Zemin or the Communist Youth League, which was the faction that supported Hu Jintao. So Xi Jinping, in 2012, he was not the first choice of anybody in China's political system. And he wasn't the first choice because he was not identified with any faction. But because he wasn't identified with any faction, he became China's leader because he was acceptable to all factions. In other words, he was the least unacceptable choice for China. Now, that's a great way to make yourself supremo in China, but it's not a great way to govern. And so Xi Jinping, in order to amass power, to effectively rule, decided he needed to have a faction. And what he looked to were certain flag officers to be the core of his political support. Now, many people say that Xi Jinping, after wide-ranging purges at the top of the PLA of quote-unquote corrupt officers, and after his top-to-bottom reorganization of the military, which occurred about a half-decade ago, many people say, well, Xi Jinping's in control of the military. Well, you can say that, but you can also maybe say this, that senior leaders of the military, the generals and admirals, may be telling Xi Jinping what to do. Or maybe Xi Jinping realizes he has to let flag officers do what they want. But in any case, we know that hardliners, many of them in uniform, are actually setting the tone in Beijing. Now, of course, it's hard to be confident about what's going on in opaque Communist Party circles, but we do see that the Chinese military lost power in the 1990s. So, for instance, there's nobody wearing a uniform who sits on the Politburo Standing Committee anymore. But we also can see that they might be making a comeback. And we got a hint of this soon after Xi Jinping was named General Party Secretary. November 2013, China declares its East China Sea Air Defense Identification Zone. Well, if we go back to the last time of Hu Jintao, who was the weakest of China's 5 generation of leaders, as they call it, well, Hu Jintao prevented the military from doing this. So, 11 months later, the Chinese military actually gets its way, and they declare the ADIZ. Now, we don't know whether flag officers were knocking on an open door or whether they told Xi Jinping to do this, but we can see clearly that the flags are getting what they want. And as of the first of this year, the Communist Party's Central Military Commission received sweeping powers over formerly civilian matters, most ominously the mobilization of society in peacetime. So I believe that flag officers wield great influence over Xi Jinping, who relies on them for their backing. And that means that the military diplomacy, as they call it, of the People's Liberation Army is now actually becoming the diplomacy of the country. And that means we hear every so often military officers mouth off in public. We hear them threatening the Navy, our Navy and the Air Force. They felt They could injure our pilots and our diplomats. They intercept our military in the global commons. The law of averages says that one of these dangerous incidents will spiral down. So there is a dangerous dynamic taking place. There's a guy named Wang Jing at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy who probably put this best about 7 years ago when he said, quote, "China's military spending is growing so fast that it has overtaken strategy. The young officers in China are taking control of strategy, and it's like young officers in Japan in the 1930s. They're thinking what they can do, not what they should do." Well, at this moment, officers from ensigns to admirals, from lieutenants to generals in China are actually talking about what they want. And they're sounding arrogant, bellicose, and indeed dangerous. And by their own admission, they're spoiling for a fight. We know that they've been trained to hate Americans. They relish the idea of killing us. They know that we know they're full of bile, and they're itching to use their new weapons. So if you want an historical antecedent for what's happening in China right now, we perhaps should look to Japan in the 1930s, because the parallels between then and now indeed are striking. So for instance, then the Japanese military, like the Chinese military today, has been emboldened what they consider to be success, and they want more. They have become ultranationalist. Then you have, like now, civilians controlled Asia's biggest military only loosely. And then you had the Japanese government talk about how all these foreign powers are trying to hold back Japan. Well, that's exactly what the Communist Party is now saying about China. So, although you and I may think that Xi Jinping should be cautious, there are incentives for him to be bold. Now, I don't think that China's military wants a war. I think that they'd like to push us out of Asia without fighting one. But nonetheless, they can do things that can trigger one. Third thing, this is the inherent nature of China's political system. In short, the friction between the United States and China is not about us. It's about them. Min Pei, a student in China who fled to the United States after the Tiananmen massacre, became a noted academic, has written this, quote, "A liberal international foreign policy is incompatible with China's illiberal domestic order." I wish I'd written this. This is the reason why I'm quoting it. Quote, "Although an illiberal regime can occasionally demonstrate tactical brilliance in diplomacy, its execution of a constructive long-term foreign policy will be undermined by the character flaws inherent in autocracies: insecurity, secrecy, intolerance, and unpredictability." And China's regime right now is having difficulty living in a globalizing world. Its leaders are insecure. They're insecure, I think, largely because they realize that although they believe that from day to day they can control the Chinese people, they know that Chinese society is volatile. And they worry that one day somebody, some remote province, sees hope for a better world or becomes desperate and triggers a crisis. So, the Chinese leaders are deeply insecure. And what makes this worse from our viewpoint is they realize the great emotional and inspirational impact that we have in people around the world, especially the Chinese. And because of our inspirational impact, because of our promotion of the things that people want, freedom, democracy, more say in your lives, human rights, that they know that they cannot survive in a world where the United States exists. So, tension with the United States is inevitable. I think communist societies, and especially China's, realize they cannot live in a democratic world. That has implications for us that we cannot avoid. Thank you.
Mr. Chang, we do have a lot of questions from the Slido feed, and I just wanted to make a note to the folks online submitting questions. We do have quite a few questions, so I've spoken with Mr. and Mrs. Chang, and we're going to take the majority of the online questions in the fourth session so that we can try and get to as many as possible. So with that, we'll go ahead and take one from online right now. What should the role of the United States and its allies be, both militarily and economically, to counter the illegal expansionism in the South China Sea?
Well, the United States, if we've had any consistent foreign policy over the course of our existence, it's been the defense of the high seas. And that's perhaps the only consistent policy we have ever had. And it's one that we cannot abandon. So we do need to protect this whole notion of open seas. The Chinese believe that the South China Sea is blue national soil, as they say. In other words, as I mentioned, they believe that it's a sovereign part of the People's Republic. And that, by the way, is in contravention of the obligations that they freely undertook when they signed and ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. I believe that we just need to patrol the South China Sea and the East China Sea and the Yellow Sea. And if we don't do that, and if China closes those off, then Russia will close off the Black Sea. Libya will then try to close off the Bay of Sidra, whatever it's called. And we'll have a very different world. This is, for us, you know, in one sense, the United States would be more powerful on a relative basis if we allowed the Chinese and the Russians to close off the world for a number of reasons. Because in a globalized world, we end up incurring the trade deficits and funding everybody else. But the point is, that's not who we are. As a nation, we do defend the global commons. And so what has occurred over the course of times is we engage in freedom of navigation operations. Unfortunately, we sometimes don't defend our own principles because we call these oftentimes innocent passages. Under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and under customary international law, a ship, including a warship, can sail through the territorial waters of another country as long as they keep their radars off and other things. And we allowed the Chinese, for instance, to sail, I think it was 6 vessels through the Aleutians going into our territorial water about 4 or 5 years ago. When the US Navy does FONOPs in the South China Sea, they often call them innocent passages. If you call something an innocent passage, what you are saying is that the land state actually has a right to that territory and that territorial water, which is not the case. Because although China may have a territorial claim to a reef or to a speck, it does not carry with it a claim to 12 miles of territorial water under customary international law and the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So we sometimes are not as bold enough in asserting what we do. But I believe that will change over time because the Chinese will push us. What we need to do is we need to be very clear with our allies and have them work with us. And this has actually been a success of both Trump and Biden policy of getting, for instance, Europe to patrol these waters with us. Even Germany, which is very pro-China under Angela Merkel, has been contributing a frigate to Indian Ocean patrols. So this is really, I think, a very good story for the United States, but obviously we've got to do more. And the issue then is, of course, Taiwan, because if we were to lose Taiwan, though it's not ours, but if we were to lose Taiwan, this would be a critical loss for us. So I believe that one of our South China Sea initiatives should be to say to Taipei that we'd be happy to sign a mutual defense treaty with Taiwan. Because if we were to do that, not only would we bulk up our defenses in the region, but we would say to the Chinese, we're not afraid of you. You know, you can do whatever you want, but we are not afraid of you. Too often, and this is a criticism of both Republicans and Democrats, every president going back to God knows when, we have sort of given the Chinese too wide a berth, and we have showed Beijing that we are afraid of what they do, which means we've given them a veto of our foreign policies, which we shouldn't be doing. So two other things about the South China Sea and Taiwan. Taiwan sits, of course, at the north end of the South China Sea. It's at a critical juncture. And since the late 1800s, we Americans have drawn our western defense perimeter not off the coast of Guam or Hawaii, but off the coast of East Asia. And Taiwan sits in the center of that critical defense line for us. So you lose Taiwan, you lose basically the South China Sea. One other thing, China's been attacking our democracy, and it's been attacking democracies in general, and an attack has been intensified in recent years. So we can't afford China to absorb any democracy, especially one as important as Taiwan. So I think that island is critical. And we know that Taiwan wants to defend itself, and we should do everything possible, including if they want a mutual defense treaty, entering into one. Yes, it'll cause friction with China, but at some point we have to understand that we've got to defend our friends and allies, we've got to defend our form of governance, and it's not about us.
Good morning. My name is Rick Inglesby, and kind of piggybacking on the Taiwan question, as far as what happened in Hong Kong, where the 30-year timeline for autonomy was violated and happened after 10 years, is that a precursor to Taiwan? And then I have heard that it's not just the resources of Taiwan, it's actually personal to the Communist Party.
Yeah, Beijing, Communist Party believes that Taiwan should be the 34th province of China, though it's never ruled Taiwan. And in fact, if you look back at quote-unquote Chinese history, there has been no Chinese ruling group that has ever ruled Taiwan. The Qing dynasty ruled Taiwan for about 50 years, but the Chinese considered the Qings to be foreigners. They were Manchus. Chinese communist history is a little bit weak on that. But the point here is not what happened 200 years ago, but the point is that you now have a people in Taiwan who don't consider themselves to be Chinese. When you look at self-identification surveys in Taiwan, about 85% or so in the recent surveys believe that they are Taiwanese only. And of course they want good relations with China. I mean, who doesn't? But they don't believe that they're part of China. The reason why Taiwan's so important to your question about Hong Kong is that Hong Kong is now part of the People's Republic. Britain handed it over on July 1st, 1997, pursuant to the agreement you talked about, the Sino-British Joint Declaration of 1984. In that joint declaration, Britain promised Hong Kong 50 years of a high degree of autonomy.
No, China promised Hong Kong.
What?
Not Britain. China promised Hong Kong.
China promised, sorry. This is why I bring my wife. China promised Hong Kong 50 years of a high degree of autonomy under the one country, two systems formula. That one country, two systems formula was developed by Deng Xiaoping, Mao's successor, not for Hong Kong, but for Taiwan. And so people in Taiwan are looking very carefully at what is happening in Hong Kong, because in Hong Kong, China has completely violated its obligations. Matter of fact, it's even said that the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which is a treaty, is not a treaty and no longer applies, which is a violation of clearly the terms of the treaty. People in Taiwan look at this and say, we don't want that for ourselves. Go back for a little bit of political history. In 2019, you have the big protests in Hong Kong. At that time, the current Taiwan president, Tsai Ing-wen, was in her first term. She wasn't doing very well. She was unpopular. She was not even going to get the nomination of her party to run for re-election, in all probability. She was toast. You have the big protests in Hong Kong, China's overreaction. People in Taiwan said, whoa. What they did was they gave Tsai the nomination, and she won the presidential election overwhelmingly. So really what's happened is China has pushed Taiwan away. Last few hours, China has raided the offices of Apple Daily, which is the main pro-democracy newspaper there, arrested the editors and some of the senior writers and some of the officials. It has really basically taken over Hong Kong. And Hong Kong is basically now indistinguishable from the rest of the People's Republic. It doesn't have this promise, which was supposed to go until 2047. This was because of the national security law that China imposed on June 30 of last year. You know, the only thing that you can say is that you cannot trust China on anything. Remember, it was in China's interest to honor the terms of this treaty. This is not like some sort of deal where I have an interest, they have an interest, and they're conflicting interests. China had an interest in honoring that treaty because they wanted to get Taiwan. But what they did was they drove Taiwan away. And so you can see that the Chinese are not long-term thinkers, as people say, because if they were long-term thinkers, they would have left Hong Kong alone to 2047 and then taken it back. But they couldn't help themselves, which means that there should never, ever, for any problem, ever be the answer, let's have an agreement with China. You have an online question?
What can you tell us about China using helium-3 from the moon as an energy source?
Yeah, this is fascinating because China has a number of goals on the moon, and one of them is commercial exploitation. And actually, a friend of mine, Brandon Weichert, who wrote a book called Winning Space, actually says that the first trillionaire is going to be the person who figures out how to mine the moon. And the Chinese, of course, are doing what the Japanese are doing, and that is trying to figure out how to mine asteroids. So obviously, this is going to be something that Beijing is going to be thinking about. And the genius of their system is that they have, you know, top, bottom, they have a lot of determination, got a lot of money, and so they can engage on projects on trying to get helium-3 off the moon. Whereas our system is, well, our government couldn't care less, but we have a lot of people who see it in their financial interest to do so. So what we do need is a little bit of government direction here, because if China does take over the moon, as they've told us, you know, they've warned us. He said, we're not going there if they believe that they can do that. So.
You hear me okay, sir? All right. Good morning, sir. Can you talk to, you mentioned China making geographic inroads on this side of the Atlantic, and I heard about the Morning Star Ranch in West Texas, 130,000 acres bordering Mexico, bordering Laughlin Air Force Base. Can you talk to how much of a threat Chinese land purchases are inside the United States?
Yeah, this is a really fascinating question. I have no idea why the Trump administration allowed that land purchase to go through, except maybe it went under the radar. But I don't know what the China's objectives are, because they say they're going to put a wind farm on it, but I can't believe that for a second. So, you know, I believe that that is a purchase that should be unwound. Now, there are, especially in the last couple of years, large purchases of farmland in places like Kansas, Oklahoma, and of course Texas, as you mentioned. That, I think, is really for a different purpose, and that is China is running out of food. And there's a food crisis there, something that was evident last year, and which I'll talk about soon. And so I think what they're doing is they're buying land in our heartland, they're buying land in Canada and in Africa for agricultural production. To me, it doesn't make sense for a number of reasons, but that's what they're doing. And so there's that motive. And I don't like it, but I don't think that that's really a national security threat. But purchasing land near Laughlin Air Force Base seems to me to be absolutely wrong. We have in the past prevented China from acquisitions of land near military facilities, and that generally has been our posture. So this Laughlin Air Force Base purchase really is out of the ordinary, but it can be unwound, and it should be.
Thank you.
The topic for this session is China's vulnerabilities, and we'll start with a summary. Beijing may be acting so aggressively because its leaders may be thinking that there is an overstretched China and that the country faces critical vulnerabilities and may not be able to accomplish what they consider to be historic objectives. So for instance, we know that the Chinese economy is continuing to stumble. It has not recovered from COVID-19. China's environment is degraded. We know that the Chinese people are restive, something evident in Hong Kong and elsewhere. And if all of this weren't bad enough, China is slated to lose people this century. China is now 4 times more populous than the United States. By 2100, we may be more or less the same size. So, China at this point faces challenges that it has got to deal with simultaneously. Meanwhile, China, of course, has made impressive advances in technology, so it does have some strengths. But I think in the long term, even technology is a vulnerability, because in China's total control system, they may not be able to out-innovate us, to be able to create the breakthroughs of this century. Now, we can slow China's technology goals, achievements, by cutting off tech and by mobilizing resources in this country, much the same way they do. You put all of this together, and it means that maybe we don't worry about China in the 2030s and the 2040s. Maybe we should view this as the decade of concern. So that's the summary, and we'll get started with this last topic. Today, I'm going to focus on 3 vulnerabilities, 2 of which China can fix, 1 of which it can't. And the first one is food scarcity, which we just hinted at a few moments ago in response to the question over here. Last August, Xi Jinping announced a Clean Your Plate program. And the Chinese people, I think, correctly interpreted that as a worry that China is going to be facing food shortages. Xi Jinping talked about a shocking and distressing waste of food. That's really odd coming from the leader of China. Now, Chinese leaders will not formally admit that they can't feed themselves. I mean, that would be political dynamite. But what we witnessed last year, and I'm sure what we're going to see in future years, is that there are going to be larger and larger imports of foreign food into China. Last year was especially difficult for China. There were floods in the country's south, drought in the north, typhoons in the northeast, and pest infestations in the southwest. All of these took their toll on China's food production. But perhaps the biggest issue were the floods. The floods affected Hubei, Anhui, Jiangxi, Jiangsu province in June. Later in the year, they were in Jilin and Heilongjiang, and they affected not just rice, which is a staple, but corn and other crops. Also, the Corn Belt was devastated by another too much water problem, that one caused by typhoons. Too much water, I think, is not the only explanation for last year's food shortages. Something also curious occurred last year. Starting in 2018 and all the way through 2020, Beijing was slaughtering pigs. And they said they were doing this because of the African swine fever. Now, a number of China watchers believe that they were slaughtering their pigs, which is really the critical meat staple for China, because they wanted to stop the spread of COVID-19. But whatever the reason is, from 2018 to 2020, China killed more than half its population of pigs. Now, China's agriculture is also affected not just by the weather and disease, but also by long-term trends. The most important is that China is losing farmland to factories. And we have seen, because of China's misguided water policies, severe shortages in the country. So for instance, the Yangtze River, which is home to 460 million Chinese, is drying up. Along its 3,900 miles, more than 1,000 lakes have disappeared in recent years. So China has now banned fishing throughout the length of the Yangtze. Water scarcity is not the only problem. Water is polluted, which means that a significant portion of the Chinese food is produced with water that is polluted and with soil that has toxic metals in it. And if all this weren't bad enough, the Chinese food tastes and preferences are changing as people want more and more different types of food, which is harder to grow. So for instance, you've got a move towards meat. which is beef, lamb, pork, poultry. This requires far more water than in the past, and China doesn't have enough land or water for now. So it can't feed itself, and it can't actually produce the feed for animals. The bottom line for all of this is that China has become the world's largest importer of food. And every projection shows it's going to be importing larger and larger amounts of food, but also larger and larger proportions of the food that it needs. There's a guy named Greg Copley. He says that the basic characteristic of every enduring great power is to become a net exporter of food, and more important, to feed its population. But China right now is not in a point where it can do it. And as I mentioned in response to the question over here, China is now buying farmland across not only our country and Africa and Canada and elsewhere. I think that we're seeing aggressive measures on the part of the Chinese as they search for more and more calories. So we can go back to imperial era where Chinese emperors actually conquered land in order to obtain food. And some people now speculate that that's the reason why they're much more aggressive towards countries like Tajikistan. Maybe. But the point that we know is that China's fishing fleet, which is about 800,000 boats, is now involved in illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, not only on the high seas, but in the waters of other countries, including Latin America. The second vulnerability is China's tech. And at first glance, as I mentioned, China looks like it's going to be a tech powerhouse. I mean, you go back a decade ago, China was not considered to be a tech competitor. Now it seems to be leading in some critical sectors. So for instance, quantum communications, maybe even quantum computing, across the board. It's no surprise how China did this. They had very determined policies at the top of the Chinese political system, and then they implemented them with determination. They had a number of multi-year plans, and as a result, the Chinese leaders have not only created technology, but they've instilled in the Chinese people the importance of technology. So for instance, through Chinese writings, you will see much about the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and the Chinese intend to lead it. They intend to lead it through a number of ways. So for instance, there's the Made in China 2025 initiative, announced in 2015, and that was to dominate 10 sectors, which has now been added 11th sector with 5G. The currently existing 14th five-year plan, which started this year, is of course tech-heavy. Beijing in 2017 announced its next generation artificial intelligence development plan, which is a three-part program to dominate AI by 2030. Now, China might not get there. China might not have as good AI as developed in other countries, including ours. But the Chinese have a natural advantage in that AI runs on data. And because in a democracy we have restrictions on what can be fed into artificial intelligence systems, that limits our ability. China has no such limits. And because of that, they do have a head start, which is an important one. Now, this brings us to 5G, fifth generation of wireless communication. China is absolutely determined to dominate 5G. They're, first of all, determined to dominate it at home. They've recently announced $200 billion for 5G base stations, about 6 million of them, that they intend to install in the next 2.5 years. They already say that they've got 700,000 5G base stations, 700,000, which is more than twice the number in the rest of the world. And China's trying to use 5G in its factories. In January, China Daily, which is an official Communist Party publication, predicted that the country would have 30 fully connected 5G factories in what they said were 10 key industries, and they said their deadline for doing this was 2023. It's not entirely clear what they mean, but we can see their intent. And their intent is to be able to remain the world's factory floor and to do that with artificial intelligence. Now, China's 5G hopes rest on Huawei Technologies, their national champion. Huawei sells more 5G gear than any of its competitors. Matter of fact, it really only has two competitors, both Scandinavian. both of which make their products in China itself, which is another key vulnerability for us. So when we start to look at all of this, we've got to be extremely concerned about China. But let's put this in context, because the most important issue in the world has been COVID-19. And this shows a weakness in China. We have 3 coronavirus vaccines. 2 of them actually incorporate mRNA. One of them doesn't. Johnson & Johnson doesn't. But we have 3 vaccines that work. China, which had a head start on the coronavirus vaccines, because they knew about this months before we did, months before we started paying attention, they've got 5 vaccines. But none of those vaccines is particularly effective except for in otherwise healthy young people. And we're not really sure whether these vaccines are safe, because they have not been showing us their phase 3 trial data. As a matter of fact, a number of their phase 3 trials, which they've announced around the world, involved very small groups of people. So this shows that in something which was obviously very important to China, it's become a propaganda ploy for them, that they have not been able to develop what we have been able to, which shows you the American genius for not only technology, but for innovation. Now, there can be a lot of reasons why China's vaccines aren't really worth a damn, but we got to remember that this is not just some sort of accident that occurred, because biotech is one of those 10 areas in China's 2025 plan. So this was obviously, even before they were thinking about COVID-19, this was something that they did want to pay attention to, and yet they have not been able to. I think part of it is, when you start to look at China, they're very good at doing what we did in terms of going to the moon. Remember President Kennedy went to Rice University and said, we're going to the moon? The Chinese are very good at doing that. And they have been successful. So for instance, they can build this big quantum computing center in Hefei, which is the capital of Anhui province. They plan to get all of China's quantum researchers under one roof. They're going to spend billions of dollars on that facility, and they probably will produce some technology. But as even the Chinese say, this is not necessarily the smartest way to go about developing tech, because they're worried about the top-down efforts, that everything is going to be politically determined, and they are not going to see what's really important, and that are the breakthroughs. So yes, China can steal. China can apply technology from others, but for the most part, they have not been able to do what we Americans have done. Now, of course, this is now a competition. If we're involved in a Cold War with China, people say it's involved in technology. We can stop the flow of tech to China. We can cut it off. We can prevent the acquisitions of US tech companies. We can end licenses. We can end technical cooperations. We can end tech exports. President Trump was actually quite effective in going after Huawei and ZTE, which is its sister company. And he probably could have put ZTE out of business and severely injured Huawei. He eventually decided for political reasons not to do so. But if we were to adopt strict enforcement postures, we could certainly affect the way China is able to develop technology. Third thing, this is China's most fundamental weakness. This is the one problem it cannot fix, because China will suffer the worst demographic decline in history in the absence of war or disease. China reported that last year its population hit 1.41 billion people, which was an increase over 2019. Consider that 2020 was a year that coronavirus ravaged China. It's really unlikely that its population increased. There is a Chinese demographer, Yi Fuxin, at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who says that China's population is probably about 1.3 billion. I think the big issue is not where China is right now, but where China is going. And we can see that China says, well, look, we've got a 1.3 total fertility rate. TFR is the average number of children that a woman of childbearing age will produce. So 1.3 is well below replacement of 2.1. It's also below what people think is China's real replacement rate, which is 2.2 because of higher infant mortality. China claims 1.3. Yi Fuxian believes no. It's probably 0.9. At the most, it's 1.1. Now, Yi's estimates are at the low end of the range, but they are consistent with China Daily reporting that in 2015, and this looked like a mistake when it was first issued, but it's probably telling the truth and realizing it later on. China Daily, which is official, reported that China's TFR in 2015 was 1.05. So the lower estimates on China's total fertility rate probably are correct. The reason why this makes a difference is if you have a TFR of 1.3, if you have one of 1.3, China's population, just do the arithmetic, will halve by the end of this century. If you're at 1.2, China's population will be 480 million. If China's TFR is what other demographers say, like the guy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, then you're talking maybe 400 million people. To put this in context, the most recent UN projections for the United States is that we will have 433.9 million people at the end of the century. So yes, we could be more populous than China in 8 decades. Now, the question is, okay, what does this mean from a geopolitical point of view? Well, because China's demographic patterns are so skewed, we don't really have very many historical antecedents to try to figure out what's going on. China had a one-child policy from 1979 to the end of 2015. And because of that, for various reasons, we ended up with abnormal sex ratios, some of the most abnormal ever seen in history. There were too many men, excess males. So what does that do to China's foreign policies? Well, if we're optimistic for a moment, it means things could actually go right, because China is not only going to get smaller, it's going to get more elderly. Elderly populations generally are not considered to be very hostile. Even if they wanted to be hostile, they don't have the resources to be able to sustain wars. If you want to see what aging does to the geopolitical ambitions of a country, look at Japan. That doesn't look so bad. Also, you got too many men running around the country, excess males, testosterone-powered violence machines, as one demographer put them. Well, maybe a country becomes less hostile toward its neighbors if you've got too many excess males at home. And the reason is that a regime will be very focused on internal stability. So a country could be racked by violence internally, but could be benign externally. One other thing. Maybe it's the opposite. So for instance, demographers say, well, look, most leaders of hardline states believe that the only way to out of control men is basically to be hardline, to be more authoritarian. And so there is speculation among demographers that China will, the liberalization that everybody wants, the democratization, will be impeded by excess males. And of course, if you believe in the democratic peace theory, which is that democracies don't go to war with each other, then of course that has negative implications. But the one theory that demographers come up with that should scare us is the bare branches theory. And the bare branches is because these males will not be able to find wives and have children and normal lives. And so the theory that you hear from demographers and national security experts is, well, maybe you have national leaders decide to go to war because they don't want these men running around causing problems at home. You might as well use them as fodder in invading neighbors. We don't know which direction China will go as it gets older, but obviously we haven't seen these patterns in the past. So at this particular time, all that we know is that the changes will be wrenching for Chinese society. We just don't know in what direction. One final thought. I come from a Chinese family. I know growing up that my dad took great pride in being part of the world's biggest society. But for the first time in at least 300 years, and maybe even all of recorded history, China's going to get overtaken. It's going to be overtaken by a country they do not respect. It's called India. And the question is, at this very moment, you have Chinese soldiers deep into Indian-controlled territory in Ladakh, high in the Himalayas, below the line of actual control. You have Chinese encroachments in Sikkim, which is part of India. And this is part of China's plan to use its population to encroach upon Nepal and Bhutan, which are close to India but separate countries. Question is, how will the Chinese view India? Will they try to use their population advantage while they think that they still have it? This is, of course, for us, going to be important because although India is not a treaty ally, it is a friend and it is important. Xi Jinping has this belief that China's going to take over the world. One of his money lines, and he said this in a speech late last year, is the East is rising, the West is declining. That is an unsustainable position if China is going to shrink this century. And that's why, people worry about China in the 2030s and the 2040s, and if you were to do the extrapolation, China is this marvelous country to behold. But maybe it's not far out China that we've got to worry about. Maybe it's the China of today, because the 2020s, not the 2030s or the 2040s, but it's the 2020s that are the decade of concern. I think Chinese leaders see a closing window of opportunity. Chinese propaganda from the beginning of last year has actually talked about time frames that are being accelerated. I believe we got a problem now, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Mr. Chang, I'll go ahead and give you a question from online. Can you talk about China's strategic goals with regards to their nuclear arsenal?
Oh. Well, China has a declared no first use policy. But I don't really believe that because we have had Chinese diplomats and flag officers talk about using nukes first. They've talked about using nukes. Matter of fact, China is the only country in the world that has ever threatened to nuke territory it considers to be its own. And that, of course, is Taiwan, where Chinese diplomat Xia Jinping about 10 years ago said that China might do that. But the more important threats from our viewpoint have been ones which were made in the first decade of this century to basically say that we would want to save Los Angeles rather than Taiwan. These are statements from flag officers that clearly indicate that China is considering the use of nukes in circumstances where they would be the first. So I believe that China has a first use, that China is willing to use nukes first. But I also believe that China is just trying to intimidate, because I don't really believe that China does want war. But I believe also that if there were to be a shooting war, that China would escalate very fast. Something that the Russians have talked about, to escalate, to de-escalate. So China talks about unrestricted warfare, and part of unrestricted warfare is using nuclear weapons in combination with other types of warfare that we would consider to be absurd, but I do believe that that's what they want to do, or be willing to do. It's really hard to look into this because we know a couple things, that they're building nukes fast now, but I don't know how many they actually have. And they may actually have fewer than we think, but the point is they have, I believe, the will to use them. It's a murky area, but it's something that, again, is a subset of a larger problem in that we tend to think about warfare in certain terms, and the Chinese think of warfare in larger terms. So we've got to be concerned that they would be willing to do something. Remember, they believe that the US does not have political will. And because of that, they can be perhaps persuade themselves to use or threaten to use nukes first, thinking that we would back down. So this is an exceedingly dangerous situation. And in general, American presidents have given lots of warnings to the Chinese about things that they're doing. And we never, or very rarely, follow up on our warnings. And so we have taught the Chinese to ignore what we say. And so that's extremely dangerous because we're being backed into a position where we have to follow through on what we say we're going to do. So you combine that with China's desperation, China's boldness. I think nuclear weapons are a major part of their war plans and that they would be willing to use them at a very early stage.
Yeah, back on the topic of demographics, can you talk about the female part of the society? Are they also not stepping out from some of the traditional roles in that family? And sort of the second part of that, is there a heavy reliance on the 5G and robotics automation? Is that part of their way of overcoming this decrease in the professional technical workforce and production capability of demographics?
Yeah, on the first question, especially urban Chinese women are not buying into sort of the Confucian, male-dominated social order that China has. So, and we see this, of course, in Japan and South Korea. So there is an historical antecedent for this. And so Chinese women are not, they don't have a goal of getting married early. They don't have a goal of having children. Also, there's an economic aspect to this. And that is, there's a thought in Chinese society that you can't really ask a girl to marry you until you've got a home. Home prices, for various reasons, are astronomical, beyond the reach of many young Chinese males. So that is a further delay in all of this. So you've got the social changes that we see throughout East Asia, and we see around the world. That is aggravated in China by these economic considerations. And your second question is, 5G and robotics. Yeah. Chinese policymakers actually are very explicit about this, that they believe that through automation they can reduce the disadvantage caused by a declining workforce. And China has, robotics is part of, I think, the Made in China 2025 initiative. We know that Foxconn, which is a Taiwanese company, but which has most of its operations in China, is going heavily towards robotics. And remember, Foxconn, the type of work that it does, which is, it's the world's largest contract manufacturer of electronics. A lot of that work is very difficult, to be done by other than young Chinese or young people because they're more nimble with their fingers. But even Foxconn is going to what they call Foxbots. So there is, both in industry and in government, the feeling that the way they can get around this is through heavy reliance on automation and technology. And they very well may not be wrong on that, but clearly they have thought this through, probably more than we have, and the reason is their problems of aging are more pronounced. Remember, the Chinese officials have seen this demographic crunch coming for a very long time. You go back 20 years is when they probably should have ended their one-child policy. That policy wasn't ended until the end of 2015. But during that period, they were thinking about how do we get through this? And they obviously didn't want to end the one-child policy because that would mean giving up control over people. Remember, the one-child policy is extremely intrusive. It is great if you're a communist because it gives you the right to control people. You can't have a kid unless you get a birth permit. They measure menstrual cycles of some women. It is really, really intrusive. The way to get around that, of course, so they've been thinking about this for a very long time. So, yeah, technology is their only hope.
We'll take one here and then online.
I've read that there has been a policy of forced movement of workers from farms into cities to try to speed up the industrialization process. and that in some cases these workers either haven't found jobs or generally were disenchanted and would sneak back into the countryside at other times, and that this has led to, in some cases, vacant cities with vacant high-rises built that they claim are still being used but are vacant. Is this real? Is it really a problem?
Yes. I wouldn't say that the movement of workers to urban areas is forced. But China's premier, actually this premier and the last one, have bragged about urbanization rates because they believe that they look at U.S. history and they see that the U.S. economy blossomed as we urbanized. So what they have done is they have tried to encourage urbanization. Now, I think they got it backwards. Urbanization was being driven by certain things in the U.S., and that was what created economic boom. The Chinese are trying, they're great planners. So they have thought, well, if we build these cities, we can encourage people to leave. And I can tell you, my dad's hometown is, even going back when I was there, the first time I was there, it wasn't so evident, but certainly the second and succeeding times, that the only people in town would be old women because everybody else was working in factories. You'd have women and you'd have children, and that would be it, because everybody else was working far away. What's happened is that they have in China a hukou system, which is you have to have a residency permit. And if you don't have an urban hukou, you basically are a second or a third class citizen in a city, and you can't get, for instance, schooling for your children, and you can't get access to social services, and it makes it very difficult. So the phenomena you talked about of people leaving factories and cities and going back home is actually true. And going back, talk about Foxconn for a moment. The big contract manufacturers on the east coast of China, in Guangdong province and Fujian province, they've had problems with getting people because workers just don't want to put up with it anymore. And so they either find jobs close to home or they just go out of the workforce. And that has really been quite interesting because although this is not good for the Chinese economy, people are just saying they're not buying into it anymore because working conditions have really been harsh. And so there was the spate of suicides about 7 or 8 years ago in Shenzhen. Someone mentioned Shenzhen at Foxconn's big factory complex there. Because people were just so unhappy with working conditions, the boredom of it, which is the reason why they're robots, by the way. So yes, all of that is true. Now, China has what they're called ghost cities, largely because of government-directed building. And so in my dad's hometown, it's not a ghost city by any means, but it has a lot of infrastructure which obviously won't be used for quite some time. Just because, remember, the way that the Chinese government has tried to boost the economy is through excessive fiscal stimulus. That's how they got through 2008, for instance. They just poured a lot of money into building roads and infrastructure and high-speed rail. And they were successful in keeping the economy going, but now they've got a problem of a lot of infrastructure which is really being either not used or in most cases underutilized.
Thank you for your presentation. It's been very insightful. If you're speaking to the 2020s as the near-term threat, could you jump back to Taiwan? You mentioned the geopolitical situation, but could you speak to specifically the economic consequences? I'm thinking TSMC and the chip shortage, and what are those implications in the near term?
Yeah, great question. A lot of people say that China will not invade Taiwan because of TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, the world's biggest manufacturer of chips. And it's not only the world's biggest manufacturer, they make some of the world's most sophisticated chips, because while we Americans design the world's most sophisticated chips, we can't make them. And TSMC makes them. And so people have said, oh, you hear this two versions, depending on who how they think about it. But either, oh, no, China will never invade Taiwan because they can't destroy TMSC, or they will invade Taiwan because they want to take over TMSC. And the way they will do it is they will make sure to avoid its factories. That's a really interesting debate. But the point is that China has, actually just a couple days ago, just announced that, remember the guy who negotiated the Phase 1 trade deal with China, the Vice Premier, Le He? He has now been charged by Xi Jinping in the last 24 hours to lead China's semiconductor manufacturing effort. And the reason is that China has poured tons of money into making itself self-sufficient on chips, but has failed miserably. There's two companies, one that is sponsored by Peking University, which is China's Harvard. The other sponsored by Tsinghua University, which is China's MIT. Both of them are in Beijing. Both of them started chip companies. Both of them wasted a ton of money. And so China's efforts largely have failed in producing a semiconductor industry. So that's why they have charged Vice Premier He to do this. I don't know whether China can actually do this or not. I mean, they did it with some things, like quantum communications, really a very sort of impressive effort. But they did it with foreigners, largely. And they did it because they put a lot of effort into it. I'm not sure that they have the focus on semiconductors, although it's critically important. Remember, China has a focus on everything. And China has so many uses for money. It's Belt and Road, it is surveillance of the Chinese people, which is really expensive. It is all the foreign aid it sends out for countries for various purposes. It's modernization of the Air Force and the Navy. You know, you name it, they've got all this money that they've been putting out and committing, and they don't have it, I think. And so I think semiconductors, it's just a guess, but my guess is that although semiconductors are really important, although the Biden administration is going to pour a lot of money into our semiconductor industry, I don't think the Chinese will be successful. They don't have a track record of success, and I don't see anything that is going to change it. Famous last words. Do you have an online?
We do. We have lots of them. And just so viewers and audience members know, if you are on the Slido event, you have the ability to upvote questions, which will, the more votes the question gets, the higher it will move in the list. So the highest question we have right now, according to the writer of the question, our own government and U.S. corporations continue to enable China. Why do you think this is?
Oh, that's a question that's bound to get me mad. May 2019, People's Daily, which is the most authoritative publication in China, declares a quote-unquote people's war on the U.S. So China is not a competitor. It's not even an adversary. It's an enemy. It's an enemy because they think we're an enemy. So why do we enrich our enemy and enable it to develop the weapons that are being designed to kill Americans? I don't have an answer to that question, except that Wall Street is powerful, the business community is powerful, and we have, as a people, remember, Americans just generally tend to be pretty generous when it comes to our geopolitical goals. Because if we didn't want to be generous, we could be much more powerful than we are. But we do things that actually undercut ourselves. And one of them is that we believe that there would only be peace in the world if we integrated China into the international system, if we gave it a stake. So this mentality has continued for quite some time. And because of that, there has been very little political support for doing the common sense thing, which is cutting off economic investment trade ties with China. I don't know what the answer is, except I think that what will happen will be, as I mentioned before, maybe when it becomes clear that this SARS-CoV-2 came from a lab, maybe we then reach a tipping point. But my great fear has always been that it's going to take the death of American service people to change the political consensus in the U.S. And once that happens, then the Walmarts of the world, the Goldman Sachs, will no longer be able to maintain this consensus, because even we Americans understand the danger of it. We've allowed China to injure our diplomats with sonic attacks in Guangzhou. We didn't do anything about it. We didn't do anything about lasering our planes. The one incident I mentioned, plus the many others, in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. I really fear that it's going to take a much more, so.
Is there evidence that genetic testing services like 23andMe are being used by China to target specific ethnic groups for bioweapons?
We don't have, I don't know if you all heard that. We don't have evidence that China has, we have evidence that China's taken DNA profiles of Americans because they offer through accredited sequencing services to 23andMe and Ancestry and all the rest of it. We know a couple things. China has the world's largest collection of DNA profiles of Americans. They got that when they bought Complete Genomics in 2013. But China's been collecting DNA from Americans through providing sequencing services and through acquisition of companies which have health data on Americans. And at the same time, China has been prohibiting the transfer of DNA profiles of Chinese out of China. So we've got to be concerned about the general aspect of this. Though, I can't say they took someone's profile from 23andMe and they're using it for creating bioweapons. But the question is, why are they doing all of these things? And so I believe that, yes, they are, but I don't have direct proof of it. And I think that as a prophylactic matter, we should just be prohibiting the transfer of American DNA to China at this particular time, given the fact that that would just be a reciprocal action, because China prohibits the transfer of Chinese DNA. And we know what Chinese researchers say about what they're trying to do, so what more evidence do we need?
Gordon, you can talk about how Cleo thinks that the Olympics...
Good. Yeah, Senator Tom Cotton says, well, we shouldn't send American athletes to Beijing for the Winter Olympics next year because China will be collecting DNA of our athletes. My good friend Cleo Pascal of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies actually wrote an article about this 2 weeks ago. I think she was the first to talk about this. And yeah, the Chinese are going to obviously do that, because if you want to breed a superhuman race of Chinese, which is what, the Director of National Intelligence, John Radcliffe, at the time said, that they're trying to build super soldiers. We know that the Chinese have been editing human embryos to create live births. Matter of fact, they're the only people that known to have done that. So yeah, of course they're going to use the DNA of the world's best athletes. I mean, if you were trying to develop people with superhuman strength, that's exactly who I would be going to, So, these guys are probably going to Usain Bolt's garbage can or something like that. But the point is, yeah, I'm sure they're doing it, and Cotton has an important point. There are other reasons to boycott the Olympics, but that's a whole nother story. But one of them is, yeah, we do not want the Chinese collecting DNA of Americans any more than they have.
What importance do you place on defeating cyber warfare coming out of China versus preparing for traditional warfare, militarily and in protecting U.S. corporate?
Here again, we have left our networks vulnerable. The Chinese have been stealing U.S. intellectual property, perhaps to the tune of $500 billion a year. That's what former DNI John Radcliffe said. It's in the hundreds of billions of dollars a year. We know this from various reports. We don't know exactly how much. So the question is, why didn't we do anything about this? This is another point where we know what the Chinese are doing, and we have purposely decided not to defend ourselves. This is a political problem because it starts at the top. And my favorite example is from November 2014, when the North Koreans attacked Sony Pictures Entertainment. They did this from Chinese IP addresses, by the way. So the Chinese who have maintained the Great Firewall, which is the world's most sophisticated collection of internet controls, the Chinese had to see the attacks going out from China's soil. They had to see the hundreds of terabytes of data that was exfiltrated from Sony as it came into China. And so what happens? Some reporter asks an FBI director or somebody, is there any other country that was involved in the Sony Picture hacks attack? And the answer was no. They were lying. They were lying to the American people. And this lie had a consequence because the Chinese were involved. They had to be involved in all of this. China and Russia together host the majority of North Korean cyber attackers. We know where the Chinese do it. It's in Shenyang at the Shilbanshan Hotel. Why aren't we doing anything about this? This is attacks on American networks. I mean, what's the question? I mean, what should we do about it? Well, we should be cutting off relations with China. I mean, they continue to steal it. If we do not impose costs on China that are greater than the benefits China receives, they will continue to do this. This is not rocket science. You do not need to get a political science or an international relations degree to figure this out. And we've had a series of presidents who have decided not to defend American networks. So of course the Chinese and everybody else are going to attack us. I'm not in the military, so I can say these things.
Is a fine of trillions of dollars of our U.S. national debt a possible penalty outcome for the COVID-19 virus?
Yes. A former American president a couple of weeks ago talked about a $10 trillion reparations. And his former trade director, a guy named Peter Navarro, said, no, it really should be 20 trillion. Whatever it is, it needs to make an impact on China because we know the Chinese are developing pathogens that will attack us. They've done this with impunity with COVID-19 so far. So just as a matter of deterrence, we talk about nuclear deterrence, which mostly works, but we know that we've got to deter them for biological attack. And the way to do that is to impose a cost on them for COVID-19. Now, that cost can be confiscating their treasuries. It can be other things, but it's got to be a deterrent effect. We've got to create the deterrent effect. And I worry about confiscating treasuries if we do it by ourselves, because that would call into question our reliability as a debtor. But if we were to do this in connection with Britain and the EU countries and Japan, then that concern goes away. So I think we should, primary focus of our diplomacy should be getting other countries to confiscate China's liquid assets. That may not be sufficient, but that certainly is a start, and it would show political will, and it would give Xi Jinping second thoughts about launching another biological attack.
Gordon, can you also talk about how the Communist Party and the military does not have sovereign immunity?
Does not what?
Have sovereign immunity.
Oh, the other thing about this is that we have the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act of 1976, which prevents Americans from suing sovereigns for claims, except under limited circumstances. The one thing about China is that it is a party state. The Chinese central government, which is the sovereign, is not that important. The party that has all the assets in China is the Communist Party. Matter of fact, the Chinese military is not a state army. It's a party army. It doesn't report to the state. It reports to the Communist Party's Central Military Commission. Communist Party does not have sovereign immunity. We know this because, first of all, it's not a sovereign, but second of all, in the Communist Party's system, there are actually 9 political parties. The Communist Party is only one of them. There are 8 so-called patriotic parties. Well, if you've got 9 political parties, Communist Party, as powerful as it is, can't obviously be a sovereign. So that means, theoretically, we could find some Chinese destroyer in the Colombo International Container Terminal and confiscate it, because it doesn't have sovereign immunity. So The Chinese military is gone. But, okay. The other things that we can do, we have, most of the Chinese state enterprises are state, but they also have party, they also report to the party. So I think we should just confiscate it and then let the chips fall where they may. This is going to be very difficult, but remember, we've just lost more than 600,000 Americans, and we have decided to do nothing about it.
Does China view private American spaceflight differently than government-led space development? Do they see commercial spaceflight as an avenue for cooperation?
China wants to cooperate with the U.S. space program because we're ahead of them in most technology. And yes, I think that they definitely see a difference. I guess, and I'm just guessing right now, Tesla right now, Elon Musk's Tesla is having real problems in China. The Chinese government is orchestrating a campaign against it. I have heard someone say, someone of a conspiratorial bent of mind, but I think that he's actually right on this, that Elon Musk not only owns Tesla, he also owns SpaceX. And what China might be trying to do is get leverage with Elon Musk on Tesla in order to get some sort of advantage over SpaceX. Sounds crazy, but in the way the Chinese mind thinks, I'm sure that it's probably right. So yeah. The issue is not, do the Chinese want to cooperate with us? Of course they do. They want to steal everything. The question is, why do we have space officials that continue to talk about cooperating with China? You have a NASA right now under new management that talks about, we should, we're all one species, why aren't we cooperating in space? I don't know.
Is China's ultimate intention to completely replace the established world order, or more conservatively, exist as an unassailable alternative to it?
Well, they tell us they want to replace us. If they wanted to sort of have a less ambitious, they wouldn't be talking all these Tianxia themes, which is really important because the Chinese know that they cannot actually rule the world in a foreseeable time frame, but they're laying the theoretical foundation for it. They're trying to convince people of it. China's propaganda is really quite effective in the sense that they float ideas. And maybe they realize people aren't going to accept them right away, but they believe that over time and over repetition, they can get people to accept this stuff. And so they've got a concerted campaign on Tianxia. So I think that we have to assume that their ultimate goal is to rule everybody. They say they want to, so why should we say, oh, they can't really mean that? We Americans don't listen to what our adversaries say.
How much of a threat would China's nuclear capabilities be if the U.S. reduces its nuclear capabilities modernization programs?
A lot. I'm going to get myself in trouble here, but I'm going to say that the land component of our arsenal, our triad, is, from a Chinese point of view, the most important. And it's aging and it's sitting in silos. And people say, well, of course, Trident subs and standoff cruise missiles are more important. I don't think the Chinese think that way. I think the Chinese are most worried about the stuff in the silos. And the reason is, I believe that Beijing thinks that there's a possibility that they could actually launch an attack on one or two cities, say, oh, we made a mistake, or don't even think of retaliating because you don't want to destroy the world. I think that they believe that we don't have the political will to defend ourselves, or they think it's a possibility. The reason why the land silos are so important is because they're so vulnerable. If they're vulnerable, the doctrine is you've got to launch if something's coming our way. And that takes the political dimension out of the Chinese calculation. If they think that we will launch because we have to. So I think that those aging missiles and those silos scattered across farmland that the Chinese want to buy is really very important for us, because the Chinese know that we will launch, because they know that we'll lose it if we don't use it. So that means China cannot go to work on us. Remember, you know, if you have an attack on an American city, which is sort of ambiguous, which could be, for instance, the Chinese sneak a bomb into New York and set it off, and it would take us months to do the forensics. During that time, they would be trying to get the US to say, well, what's the use in retaliation? It's just mass murder. So I think the Chinese are maybe bold enough to do that. Normal circumstances, they won't, but if they're really desperate, you cannot put anything past these guys. I mean, all of this, of course, is speculation, but, you know, nuclear deterrence is speculation.
Can we take one over there and one over here, and then we'll have a break?
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, sir. Relative to American companies, how involved would you say China is with Silicon Valley, Facebook, Google? Would that be a concern for you? And then what can the ordinary everyday person do? Because we can't pass laws, what can we do in our daily lives? So, sort of three questions there.
Yeah, well, China has infiltrated every institution in American society, and that would include Silicon Valley. But I believe that, I don't do domestic politics, but I don't think that is much of an effect. I think that you have a lot of kids working in those companies that have attitudes which, you know, are sort of reminiscent of postmodern thinking or something, whatever you want to call it. So I don't really think that they are actually that effective. China, though, is more than Russia, uses its troll operations against the United States. So that's the way they influence us. But I don't think that they've got a lot of people at Facebook, for instance, who says you should do this or you shouldn't do that. It's just a guess. I don't know. But it doesn't strike me that they have gotten to that level of infiltration. And your second question, what can American citizens do about this?
Yes, sir.
I think that there's a certain amount of outrage that American citizens can express, which actually are quite effective. Go back to May 26th, for instance. That's the day that President Biden ordered the intelligence community to come up with its assessment on the origins of COVID-19. Got to remember what happened that day. In the morning, CNN issued that story which said the State Department spiked the story into the origins of COVID-19, its investigation. So that story triggered outrage across the American public, not only among policy elites, but also among people who use Facebook and Twitter and other social media. That's why President Biden, I think, in the afternoon actually issued that order to the IC. You know, remember, Biden is particularly uninterested in the origins of COVID-19. He spent 2 hours on the phone with Xi Jinping in February, and by Biden's own admission, he never raised it, which to me is quite astounding. So it's not something that Biden would want to do. He would only do it if he were forced to do it. And on May 26th, we saw the American people force their president to do something he didn't want to do. And my guess is that when Biden woke up on the morning of May 26th, he had no idea that he was going to order the IC to do that investigation. So all I can say is, you know, go to Twitter, go to Facebook, go to Instagram or whatever, and just express your opinion and outrage. And basically, you move institutions that way. So, you know, I don't know what more one can say than that, except we are a democracy. We change our congressman every 2 years, our senators every 6, our president every 4. You know, 2022 is just over the horizon.
John?
Thank you.
Yes, sir, I want to ask you about, you alluded to the U.S. debt that the Chinese hold. When people discuss this, I'm never sure how concerned to be about this, because I recall the old saying that if you owe $1 million to the bank, you're in trouble, but if you owe $1 billion to the bank is in trouble.
Yeah.
So if we owe, something like, I don't know, 10 trillion or something to them, because they've sort of been our bank, who's really in more trouble?
Yeah, 1.3 trillion maybe or so, maybe a bit more. The answer is, I worry a lot about China. That's one thing that doesn't worry me, and the reason is, the Chinese are malicious. August 2008, they first start talking about the nuclear option, which is to sell US treasuries to hurt the United States. And every once in a while, you get some Chinese general officer mouthing off in public saying, if the Americans don't leave the South China Sea or whatever, we're going to sell their debt. They never do it. And the reason they don't do it is because of the way the financial markets work. 100% of American debt is denominated in our currency. So if the Chinese sell treasuries to hurt us, they get back dollars. That doesn't do them any good. What they got to do to hurt us is to take those dollars and to put them into assets denominated in other currencies. Euros, pounds, yen, whatever. That would drive those currencies through the ceiling. They'd go soar in value. That would destroy the economies of Britain, the EU, Japan. And so the central banks in those countries, Bank of England, Bank of Japan, EU Central Bank, have got to go into the market to rebalance their currencies, to bring their currencies down. And the only way they can do that is through dollars. So what the Chinese could do is they could roil capital markets or financial markets for, a couple weeks, maybe even a month or two. But by the end of it, we'd have our debt held by our friends, and the Chinese would have shown themselves to be even more aggressive than we imagine. So they don't do it. That's why. Now, I'm not saying that the United States should spend money like we have. Obviously, we should not. But if we choose to do so, we can do so without the permission of the Chinese.
So Mr. Chang is going to answer some more questions. So if you are still conversing, if you don't mind either taking your seat or taking it outside of the auditorium for us, please, and thank you. Okay. First, we'll address, are there any folks who are still here in person with us that would like to come up and ask some questions? Yes. Doug? Okay. Yeah, Here you go.
So this is Doug Nguyen. I just have a question for you. So when we study the Air War College, there's a Chinese philosopher called Sun Tzu. So when you're trying to get into a conflict, you got to make sure you know yourself and know your enemy, right? So do you think how well China understands the U.S. military might, our war-fighting capabilities, what they call our objective and also our policy of deterrence?
Yeah. I think the Chinese have a pretty good idea of how fearsome we are. But Beijing doesn't really think that that's that relevant. I think what they think is political will. I mean, we are a democracy. And so my sense is that Beijing believes that it can defeat the United States despite the firepower of the American military. So, I mean, they look at politics. Remember, Mao Zedong himself said, you must put politics in command. And for Chinese officials and Chinese leaders, politics is paramount. So military might is secondary. That's why I don't think that they look at it that way. They look at how do you defeat an enemy through other means. And it's not just Sun Tzu, but it's just also common sense that if you're going to defeat the United States, you're not going to win a head-on confrontation. That calculus could change. I mean, the Chinese are starting to think about, they're building ships at a very fast pace. They're doing all sorts of stuff. They think that they can disable us with cyber and all the rest of it. But I still think they're very, very concerned about the US military in the long run. And remember, what's complicating their calculations is that it's not just the US anymore. It's, Japan, it's India, maybe Vietnam. Taiwan still is got a good military. So I think that they are starting to see the political dimensions of this, and that's why they're so concerned You know, when you look at their trend of what they say on, you know, People's Daily, China Daily, Global Times, all the rest of it, they really are concerned about the linkages the United States has with countries in the region. And they sort of, and you know this because going back to March, when China's two top diplomats came to Anchorage, Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi, they surrounded that trip with a propaganda blast was malicious in the extreme. They talk about how the United States has its ties with its allies are all white supremacy linked. I mean, they're really concerned about the U.S. developing stronger relations with countries in the region. So they're trying to divide the region by saying, well, look, you know, we're all Asians. We should, you know, have Asia for Asia. Going back to almost the Japanese Greater Co-Prosperity Sphere, you know, the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere of the 1930s that's sponsored by Japan. They're starting to raise those same issues of get the white guys out. So they wouldn't be doing that if they weren't concerned about countries in the region working closely with the United States.
So at one time, we signed a treaty with Russia we call the Mutually Assurance Destruction Act. I think China, like they also believe that they need something like that, just like we did with Russia before.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
Yeah, sorry. The MAT stand for Mutual Assurance Destruction. That we had the treaty with Russia before. Do you think that China would like to do something like that with us?
You mean arms control agreements?
Yeah, like if they fire a nuclear, weapon against us, they can rest assured that we're going to retaliate, right? So that nobody's going to do it.
Well, that's what I worry about.
Yeah.
But on the issue of arms control agreements with China, China's been very clear it will not sign an arms control agreement with the United States. And you know, both President Trump and Biden, have been talking about resurrecting deals with Russia, and everyone's been talking about getting China in the room on that. The Chinese have absolutely just come out and said flat out, no, we're just not participating in any arms control discussions.
All right, thank you.
All right, we'll take one from Slido. Given the internment camps and forced labor, why do you think there is not greater pushback from the Muslim community, especially Kazakhstan?
It's because...
Gordon, you have to look into the camera for online.
I think it's because, I mean, this is really one of the most perplexing things. It's because China has worked very hard with the leaders of Muslim majority countries to try to give them things so that they won't actually say anything about this. And that's why, the best example is Erdogan of Turkey. In 2009, Erdogan actually called what China was doing a genocide, before it actually probably was a genocide. But today, Erdogan is not calling it a genocide. Matter of fact, Erdogan's government has been sending Uighurs back to China. So part of this, I think, is that China has given the Turkish government all sorts of money. Erdogan has mismanaged his economy, and he depends on a lifeline of Chinese investment, especially into Turkey's ports, Kum port, for instance, in Istanbul. So Erdogan is not saying anything derogatory about the Chinese. And that's, I think, also true. You see that in Saudi Arabia, where the Saudis are at least thinking about establishing stronger relations with China, so they won't say anything. This is really very distressing. But it is what it is. And it just shows you China's very effective with a lot of third world countries. Part of it is because China's always had this, going back to Mao, has always talked about how China should work together with the third world against the Western democracies, or I should say democracies in general. So that's where we are on that. And I think that's not going to change for quite some time. But I also think that long term, that's not going to work to the benefit of ruling elites in those Muslim majority countries.
I think if you're okay with it, we'll take our final 2 questions from our audience members and then wrap up.
Since we in general approach things from, an ethical and moral standpoint when developing and certainly when utilizing new technologies, how can we as a nation who follows those rules, if you will, deal with a country like China that apparently doesn't have those same feelings?
Yeah, this comes up in the bioengineering of humans, because in the United States, as in most of the world, it's considered to be unethical to gene edit human embryos. But we know that Professor He Jiankui of the Shenzhen Tech University did this in 2018. And although he was punished for it later on, it was clear that he had the support of Beijing. The only reason why he was punished was because there was an uproar around the world. But in general, China has attracted some of the best Western talent in the field because there are no restrictions on what they can do. Beijing throws money at them and attracts them because they can do what they want. The only way you can stop something like that, I think, is, and this might be difficult, it might not be that effective, but I think we should criminalize behavior of American citizens working in this area. We should do everything we possibly can to prevent technical cooperation. And that means, these partnerships that universities have with China, we should end those. We should not allow China to buy tech companies, as I mentioned. These are things that we absolutely have to do. And ultimately, we may not be that effective because it is a race to the bottom, but there are certain standards I think that we've just got to adhere to. Because ultimately, and here I'm just being an optimist, ultimately I think people who want to do the right thing will prevail. Now, I can't give you any support for that notion, and I'm probably just hoping and wishing and not really being an analyst, but ultimately these things are so disgusting what China's doing that I think it will repel the world. But we need leadership on the part of the US. We got to work with our allies. We just got to work to stop this cooperation because it's very, very dangerous. The Professor He, when he took out the CCR5 gene or whatever it was to make the twins resistant to HIV, he was also, people saying, trying to enhance their intelligence, which just evokes the eugenics experiments of the Third Reich. It's just too disgusting. So I hope that the world just rebels, that repels the world.
If there's no one else, so in your first segment, you spoke about Xi trying to establish a power base within the military ruling elites. Does that mean he's reversed the previous strives to end the corrupt military ownership of private companies and using their positions to profit through the private state companies?
He has moved against that. I mean, the main thrust was during the Jiang Zemin years when the PLA was supposed to divest its profit-making businesses, but it never really did that. And this was brought home to me because we were living in Shanghai, and one of our favorite bars, sort of like a bar nightclub type place, was actually owned by the Chinese Air Force. It was right down the street from us. Everybody knew it.
Don't worry, he went to that nightclub with me. He didn't go alone.
So it wasn't that effective, and also the links, and in a communist society, the linkages between the military and state enterprises are very tight. And so you don't actually have to own it in order to benefit from it. So it's pretty murky, and I don't understand all of it, but I think that the military still is deeply involved in commercial activities, just in ways which are harder to see. Remember, Huawei Technologies was started by a former PLA colonel. He mustered out, and day one he musters out of the Chinese Air Force or whatever. Day two he gets a lot of Chinese government money. How does that work? So, I can't tell you the transmission links here, but obviously they do exist. And because their society is organized differently, you don't have to have that same sort of ownership to be able to benefit from stuff. There's all sorts of contracts, all sorts of stuff that you can do where money just gets passed to senior military officers from a nominally, non-military enterprise.
Well, for those of you who are still around with us and anybody left on virtual land, thank you very much for coming out today for the event, and thank you very much to Mr. Chang and Mrs. Chang. We very much appreciate you coming down and putting on this event here at Doolittle Institute.
Well, it was a thrill for us to do it, so thank you very much. I mean, when do I get the opportunity to tell people my unvarnished thoughts, right?
Thank you.